Black Dinner was an infamous event in Scottish history that caught George R. R. Martin's attention and inspired him to write The Red Wedding. Along the way, while delving into this corner of history, we noticed quite a few other parallels and possible influences, or at least happy coincidences. Happy to us, that is. Maybe not to the people involved. As we'll see, a lot of these stories are pretty bloody. Regardless, they make for a great series of stories and anecdotes, which we've compiled for you today. Much of it will revolve around houses Stuart and Douglas, and at one point Douglas splits into the Black Douglases and the Red Douglases, a familiar split, since we're familiar with red and black dragons and all. But also we'll be talking about the kings of England and royal Scottish figures like Robert the Bruce, and some King Jameses, several of them really, but two in particular. And the actual murders at the Black Dinner occurred in late 1440. But we'll be looking back quite a bit farther than that to cover the history of the players and the families involved and other parallels, stuff like that. All that juicy, juicy context in Scottish history that's relevant today. Then we'll continue a little bit past the Black Dinner to see what happened in the aftermath, because things did sort of come to a close of sorts. That chapter sort of closed in some ways. You'll see it does form a bit of a story, what we've put together here. Just like the Red Wedding, there was a fallout, right? But that fallout, like the Red Wedding, was just more violence, more intrigue, more murder, alliance, betrayal, rebellion, and some more parallels. That'll take us up to the year 1484, roughly speaking. You may notice how this overlaps much of what we saw in our recent Wars of the Roses episode, which somewhat officially ended in 1487. So only 3 years apart. It's almost exactly the same timeline. There's going to be some overlap, a few of the same characters, some back and forth impacts. For example, if you caught that episode, you might recall that Margaret d'Anjou, who is our Cersei parallel, recruited a lot of Scots under James II to fight for her and her son Edward, which, we called that Edward Joffrey. So when we were talking about the Wars of the Roses, though, we acknowledged that it was famous long before George. People like Shakespeare in particular made it famous. In this case, there's been a reverse influence effect of sorts, as the Black Dinner has grown in popularity because the word has been out for over 10 years at this point that it's the inspiration for the Red Wedding. And that, because Game of Thrones is so popular, drew a lot more attention to it, and lots of articles and think pieces have been written about it. Now, that said, you have to sift through a lot of takes on those comparisons because they are kind of shallow. They're just, hey, this inspired the Red Wedding, and then there's not a lot there. They don't analyze it very well. They just give you some basics. So for us, it was more work to sift through all this, which was pretty fun, actually. There's a lot of fun stuff here. And it's even though it's more obscure, that doesn't make it less interesting. In fact, it might make it even more interesting. So that's kind of a neat thing that George and HBO brought this event forward. And we, in turn, dug deeper to get to some of these interesting stories. And, of course, like the Red Wedding, the Black Dinner by itself is not the story. The Red Wedding, it's not the story of the Red Wedding, A Song of Ice and Fire. I mean, that's 60% of the way through the third book. It's a major event, but it's not even the climax of that book, let alone some end of the series. It's a big moment, to be sure. It's a shocking standout event. And the same thing is true of the Black Dinner. It's not the whole story, but it is a big part of the story. A shocking standout event. I mean, imagine hearing about the Red Wedding without knowing who Robb and Catelyn and Roose Bolton and Jaime Lannister and the Freys are. It would still sound like a crazy, shocking event, but the context is what makes it so interesting, what makes it stick with you and what makes you feel it. And that's what we're going to try to do today as much as possible by bringing this history to life and enriching it with A Song of Ice and Fire takes and parallels as much as possible. We've got all that and more for you today on this episode of History of Westeros podcast. Hello and welcome back, everybody. It's another episode of our show. This is one of our History and Westeros episodes, less than a History of Westeros episode. Certainly has some Westeros history in it, but it's more about the real world. We're here most Sundays at 3 o'clock for our live streams. Afterwards, you can find the podcast episodes up on Spotify and anywhere you find podcasts. You can get them ad-free, though, if you sign up on Patreon. Hey, Sean, how's it going? I haven't seen you in a few weeks here. We've been traveling and doing some other stuff, but good to have you back. Branzig, as you are.
Yeah, it's good to be back. I'm jealous of you guys' adventures in Spain. It's probably too much to get into now, especially for how much we got on this Black Dinner build-up. But there are so many things in this little take we've got here that sound fantastic. I'll say it like that. Yeah. I can't wait to talk about the Stone of Destiny.
It's the Stone of, I know, right? The Stone of Destiny. That's a real thing in an episode that's not about fantasy or barely has to do with fantasy. No kidding. Yeah, there's some surprises in this one for sure. Some things you may have heard of but didn't recognize as part of this, and some other things that are a little familiar that you might learn more about. And we have an extra shout out today. We always shout out Nina right here, but today's a little different because this is the last time we're going to call her Nina Friel. That's right. She's still going to be at goodqueenally.tumblr.com. You'll still be able to find her over there and all her blog posts, but she's going to be Nina Cruisling going forward. Congratulations to Nina for getting married.
No, she just changed her name.
She's just changing her name. No, as of this recording, she's not married. By the time most of you hear this, she will be. And her spouse-to-be is James Cruisling. It's almost funny that his name is James because there's a lot of Jameses in this episode. He has the distinction of being the only James that we'll mention today who is still among the living. And hopefully will be for quite some time longer. But yeah, these other James, pretty long dead. So he's got them all beat in terms of being alive. And
I'd say
that's pretty cool.
I'd say Nina found her Jaehaerys, but she hates Jaehaerys.
So yeah, no, she wouldn't like that.
She would not like that, exactly. So do not make that reference to her.
But she is good Queen Allie, so that's where that comes from, yeah. So once again, congrats to Nina and James. And hey, my own grandfather's named James too. So, you know, we got James runs in the family around here.
James in my family too.
Oh, nice. Yeah, it is a good name. And in fact, we'll be going over in this episode, we'll see when it becomes a popular name in Scotland. This is Topic Smoot episode number 10. We've got 2 more Topic Smoot episodes for the year as we wrap up 2024. Y'all voted on some episodes, y'all who are patrons, that is, and this is the result of that. If you have questions about this episode or anything else related to us, you can go to our website or hit us up at westeroshistory@gmail.com, and we will respond accordingly. In this episode, you're going to hear some of the following parallels. Besides the Red Wedding, we're going to talk about Aenys, Blackfyre, Bittersteel's skull, Unwin Peake, Tywin Lannister quite a bit, Blackfish. The whole idea of cadet branches comes about a lot. There's a whole lot of illegitimate children. There's revenge murders for various reasons. The good old-fashioned Games of Thrones with the James of Thrones, in this case, I guess you could say, at least later in the episode. And if you catch a parallel that we missed, hey, this is real history and we don't know it quite as well, or not even half as well as we know A Song of Ice and Fire history. So, you know, we could miss a thing here or there. So if you catch something that we missed, let us know. Let us know for sure. I mean, that's true always, but I feel like it's maybe a little more likely in this. Let me read the headers we've got prepared for you. These are the topics we've got today that we'll get into. We're going to get into the players, then the recent history of Scotland, King Haakon and the Alexanders, then Alexander III, then the Great Cause, which, yes, should sound like the Great Council, because it is a lot like the Great Council, then the Old Alliance, the King in the North, King Robert and the Spider, of Braveheart and Bittersteel, the Scottish Golden Company, the Flower of Chivalry, the King in Chains, Scotland's Game of Thrones, the Red and Black Douglas, Black Douglas versus Fireball, that's right, Fireball's in here too, Archibald the Grim, that's a guy's name, Robert the Kinslayer, that's a name we gave him, James and the Black Douglas, not to be confused with James and the Giant Peach, but feel free to make that comparison if you want, a changing of the James, the Black Dinner, the Blackfyre Dinner, and the Black Douglas Death. That's a lot of topics, so let's get to it. Starting.
One clarification I want to make is that recent Scottish history, you don't mean like the 1990s. You mean the recent history leading up to the Black Dinner. I was a little confused at first by that.
Yeah, you're right. Not recent. You're right. Recent as to the perspective of the Black Dinner. So recent compared to 1440, not recent to us. Yeah, good call. So as with our Wars of the Roses episode, this is a story of the Black Dinner as told through the eyes of A Song of Ice and Fire fans. I'm going to be filling this episode with all the parallels, not just because they're fun, but it fast forwards your knowledge of the story by making comparisons that you're already familiar with. But Sean, even though this is a very similar time to the Wars of the Roses, we're covering a similar era, like these things were happening in concert in a lot of places, the sourcing isn't quite as strong, is it?
No, it's not. And, we're going to go through a lot of history, like a couple hundred years worth of build up to the Black Dinner. But the Black Dinner itself, some of it is a little dubious. Some of it is like clearly known and certain, right? But some of the details of like that actual dinner are potentially, if not probably, legendary, that a lot of it is, recounted by people 20 years later and such. So it, probably mostly true, or at least representing of the truth, but some of it might be a little in question. But we won't let the facts get in the way of a good story.
That's right. It's not like the
lack of facts.
it's not like you invite chroniclers to your murders, like you're gonna commit some awful event. Let's bring some witnesses to make sure this gets recorded, right? Yeah. But it's also interesting. It was something we talked about before the episode, and the lead up to this is looking at different perspectives during this. We've always, of course, looked at the Starks as good guys, especially in the perspective of the Red Wedding. And that's probably the right way to look at it. I mean, your mileage may vary, but that's a normal thing to do. But it was interesting for us to look at this from different perspectives, because in this version, there isn't good guys and bad guys. There's just a bunch of guys.
There's just bad guys.
Yeah, and some ladies too, but they're not as bad or not as deeply involved, although sometimes they are.
I will say sometimes the lack of facts, got me digging in different ways or considering other potentials or perspectives, and the gist of what very brief spoiler alert, what happens in a Black Wedding is that there's a young boy who's in a position of power, and other people in position of power worry what he might go on to do, or maybe want to get more power for themselves, and they kill him. They have a dinner, they invite him, and they kill him, and but I was thinking about it in terms of comparing to the Red Wedding. We think of Robb as like the protagonist, and evil Tywin and Roose or whatever kill him. But if you think of it from the perspective of Tywin or the Crown or whatever, Robb was a traitor. He was a usurper. He started a war. Now, not that Tywin didn't also do a bunch of, dangerous, violent things. But, if you could eliminate a lot of other stuff Tywin did and just look at the Red Wedding, it's still troublesome because so many thousands of soldiers were killed. But all those soldiers, they swore to follow this traitor. There is a perspective where you could see that this might have been better for the realm, right? Yeah. If you think of Robb as this guy running around with the army, starting a rebellion, maybe there is some argument that you need to kill this guy, and that he didn't get a trial. Maybe that's not fair, but Ned didn't give a trial to that deserter from the Wall, even that opening scene, right? It's anyway. Sometimes it's interesting for me to think about, why did they kill this kid? Because exactly who did it and what their motivations are. There was a mock trial, like we know, quote unquote, know that there was a mock trial, but I could not find what even ostensibly they were charged with at the mock trial.
I did find one thing on that, so we'll get to talk about it. But yeah, it's vague. Like you said, it's not well established, which leads to the idea that's a bit trumped up. And I love this point too, Sean, because even if you don't have to agree with Tywin, of course you probably don't, very few of us do, but that doesn't mean there isn't value into seeing his perspective, because you understand why he does the things he does. You don't have to agree with any of it, but you want to understand the logic behind it, and that's the case here.
It from happening next time.
Yeah, how powerful people think.
Like him is bad. And
what does a ruthless person do in a spot like this? Things like that. So that's a lot of fun. That's really interesting, and we'll be doing a lot of that today. Well, we're going to start here with a quote from the man himself, George R. R. Martin. Let's go.
The names in A Song of Ice and Fire were something I devoted a fair amount of thought to. I violated a fair amount of rules that they teach you when you are a young writer. When I was younger, I tried not to violate them, Never have two characters in a story whose names start with the same letter. People will get confused. Certainly never have two characters with the same name because people will get really confused. I encountered English histories and the names are all Henrys and Edwards. In French history, it is all Louis and Philips. Even the secondary families are using the same names over and over again. There were particular names associated with particular houses. I decided to do that. To hell with the rules. The readers can pay attention. I even have characters occasionally get confused about which Brandon is being talked about.
Go and break those rules, George. Those rules suck. I'm totally with George on that. Like, we can pay attention. Yes, maybe it eliminates some people from reading this book, but too bad for them.
You know, to be fair, when people study British and French history, they get confused also.
Yeah, I got confused a lot. There's so many confused. We're going to do our best to keep that from being a problem here by using nicknames and all that. But yeah, James and Douglas here are like the equivalent of Edward or Richard or Henry, or there's so many Williams too. I mean, it's crazy. There's just so many of them. You know, it's really fun. And there's so many Margarets too. We'll see it again. You know, the one guy even changes his name to Robert, and there's so many Roberts here. It's just also Scottish history is better with nicknames than English history. So we got a lot of colorful nicknames, and that really helps.
You know, I didn't even think about it till you were talking about names, like family names in your family, or talking about James and Nina and all. I realized that my dad and my granddad's names are William, Wallace, and Robert.
Ah!
And my sister's name is Margaret.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah. Scottish power is in play here. So yeah, Stuart and Douglas are the major two houses we're going to introduce here and follow throughout this history. Douglas is a lot like Lannister and Tully, but some Baratheon, because they split at one point, which, you know, that's kind of the Targaryen thing, but they're very often the power behind the Stuart throne, and sometimes before the Stuarts came to power, which is very Lannister-ish, and they're very often the most powerful house in Scotland at any point in this story. And they're still around even today. There's even a Swedish branch of the Douglases that's around, and there's a Lord Douglas Hamilton around today. And yeah, they still exist. They're still really powerful. And at that time, though, there's just little doubt that they were the most powerful house in Scotland and held on to that for a long time. We don't know how long ago they were founded, but the first known recorded Douglas, who was a lord, was in 1179, and he was a William. And most of the ones coming after him were also Williams. Douglas has a lot of heart sigilry around it, which is a little confusing because we just compared them to the Lannisters when actually the Stuarts have the lion sigils, but you can ignore that. We don't care about sigils too much today. Stuart is a lot like Baratheon and Tyrell. So both of them are like Baratheons, yes. This, in the case, is they're a new royal house. Relatively new in the time of the story, and they're descended from Stuarts. Stuart, their name even becomes that. It's a mix. It gets so confusing that you just call them Stuart because that's what they are. And they're related to Robert the Bruce, who's going to come up big in this story. They were originally a French family, descended from a guy named Walter Fitz-Alan. He came over in 1136 to serve as High Steward for David I, King of Scotland. And David even supported Matilda during the anarchy, so they were on the blacks' side, basically, while King Stephen was the greens. So this guy was around for a while. He was steward for 3 kings, a bit of an Otto Hightower vibe, maybe, and eventually they became Mary Queen of Scots, this line. But and then they became the whole of Britain became under this umbrella. So there's where the Tyrell parallels, and some of the rest will come on along here as we're talking. And Walter was given a lot of lands, and from there the house really took off. So there's a lot of others, of course, but the Douglas family and the Stuart family are the main ones. We're also going to talk about House Bruce quite a bit. That you might recognize House Bruce from Braveheart. The movie is not historically accurate, but it's a very useful reference point because most of you have seen it probably. And again, while it throws history out the window, the character portrayals in terms of their personality, their basic bearing, that stuff isn't too far off. At least if we stick to the major characters like William Wallace and King Edward I and Prince Edward, who becomes King Edward II. And Robert the Bruce himself is actually the real Braveheart. In Scottish history, he's the guy that they call Braveheart, not William Wallace, Mel Gibson's character. And he didn't actually betray William Wallace in the movie, so that was kind of a, hey, that's like one of our national heroes, and he's betraying William. Hey, come on, don't do that. Anyway, we're going to describe how we got that nickname, and it's in the Song of Ice and Fire parallel. So that's pretty cool. There's so many Roberts in this story, as I said, partly because of Robert the Bruce, and that's part of where the Robert Baratheon parallels come in to some degree. There's no Cersei, but there's a lot of Margarets. And like I said, there's no Jamie, but there's Jameses. And Jamie, James, that's kind of the equivalent. And if you thought we were done with all the Edwards, you are incorrect. There's plenty more Edwards to come, because I know you just love all the Edwards. Yeah. So let's get into it. Recent history of Scotland. Mostly this was a long series of struggles against the throne of England. But it starts with the ousting of the Norse. Yes, the Norse had long dominated northern Scotland, especially the Isles around Scotland, because they're a culture with lots of ships and competence with ships. And so taking islands makes a lot of sense for them. But the struggles against the Norse are how Stuart and Douglas and some of these others rose to prominence in the first place by defeating them. Yeah. So that's pretty neat. There's a lot of elements of Dorne in Scotland here. You're going to think of them as the North a lot, because they are, but the way they behave, the way they deal with war is a lot more like the Dornish. So that's an interesting fusion of the North and Dorne, the two extreme ends of Westeros here in Scotland, and I think that's really cool. And as the power of Scotland's throne grew, they became more powerful, and the internal infighting intensified. So what we're going to have is a series of going from fighting for independence to gaining power to starting to fight amongst themselves as that power was shared within the country and accordingly fought over. Yeah, lots of castles and houses and armies and all that good stuff. So let's get going with King Haakon and the Alexanders. King Haakon Haakonson, yes, son of Haakon. He was Haakon IV, very formidable guy, living legend. And when he was a baby, his father was poisoned, and two guys snatched the baby and snuck through the mountains in extreme cold and blizzard, just snow hike to save this kid. They still eventually caught him, and he still refused to call them kings even at 3. When he was 8, his uncle, Haakon the Crazy. How is his uncle named Haakon when his father was named Haakon? I don't get it, but maybe that's why he was the crazy. He conspired with the king to cut Haakon, young Haakon, out of the will, out of his succession. And he said, no, you can't do that. This 8-year-old said, you can't do that because my lawyer wasn't there. And they said, who's your lawyer? And he said, God and Saint Olaf. So you've heard the phrase, God is my co-pilot. Yeah, Haakonson said, God is my lawyer. So this is interesting too, because Sean, you would expect, you hear about the Norse, you hear about Norse kings and all this. How did they not just kill this boy, right? Wasn't that what you would expect? Just kill him and then just take the throne, right? But that's not how they did it. This is not the Norse kingdoms of a few hundred years before. They're a little bit more civilized, a little bit more anyway.
They were going to kill him, but he said, you can't. My executioner isn't here.
Well played, young King Haakon. So that's really interesting, I think, and it's important for our story because a lot of these royals and nobles were treated better than you would expect, which leads us to the Black Dinner, where they definitely were not. And the other neat thing here is to point out that the Scots continue to win their independence against badasses, actually strong kings. Usually countries win their independence when there's a moment of weakness from the ruling nation. But Scotland was like, nah, we'll take on the big boss leaders here and still beat them, or at least hold our own. So that's part of what makes this episode pretty fun, is these are good stories. Very stories of overcoming adversity and odds. So this King Haakon was friends with the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. I talk about powerful friends. And he was friends with Henry III of England, who was the king at the time, which he leveraged into power over Scotland. It's like the old boys club. Henry is like, I'll take the parts of Scotland and you take the islands and we'll split it up evenly, right? Yeah, that's pretty much what they did there. So this is a very dangerous guy. And this is who they're going to take on. First of all, King Alexander II comes into play, and he says, hey, how about you sell us the Hebrides Islands? Those are the islands right off the western coast of Scotland. They're really close. It's like an archipelago. There's a bunch of islands there. And he says something to the effect of, the gold price? Outrageous. I'm not selling the islands. His his son, King Alexander III, goes a bit farther and says, let's raid the Isles in secret, kind of like how Tywin or maybe the Dornish raided through proxies. Maybe the Princess of Dorne, we've got examples of her encouraging raids without actually supporting them or supporting them in secret. There's a lot of examples of when the Dornish rebels or Dornish raids happen and there's suspicion that they're being supported or funded by someone much more powerful. Definitely the case here. But he wasn't done with that. The raids were just kind of feeling things out. His long-term plan was to invade. But King Haakon, again, not the typical Viking king, had spies and informants and learned of this plan and was able to quickly mount an expedition of 120 ships. 120 ships quickly, like within weeks he was sailing. That is crazy. Very well organized. Like, Sean, you remember Balon Greyjoy when he's mustering his ships? What did he do? Like...
What do you mean? What did he
do? Well,
he
hid. Like, he didn't let anyone know he was doing it.
Oh, yeah.
He concealed it because it took so long, and if anyone found out, they would know what he was up to. So 6 months or more that he kept it a secret.
Other people could plan for it and build their own ships or attack the ships being built, on and on, yeah.
Or prepare, yeah.
Ships, that's a lot. That's no joke. That's plenty enough to, like, embargo a port, transport thousands of troops. That's a lot.
Yeah. So Theon, when he shows up the Iron Islands, he's like, oh my God, they're getting ready for war. I had no idea. And then we only find out like 6 months later, the ship that dropped him off was held there for like half a year to keep that secret. So he sails to Largs, a place that actually had a large Norse population on the mainland, to make his base. Now, he didn't want to fight. He just wanted to intimidate them because, he wants the tax revenue and all that. He's not trying to like kill people that he doesn't have to because those are people paying him taxes. Alexander III was really clever. He's like, oh, what if we negotiate? We'll negotiate. Yeah, and he drags it out. He lets the weather turn to storms. And once a storm hits, they make their move. Alexander III, his high steward, was Alexander, who was the fourth high steward of Scotland. And this guy led the attack. And they win. It's a very small army against a much bigger one. And that's amazing. They throw out the Norse, and it looks like the Norse are just going to come back the next year because, it was a temporary victory. And then Alexander, the fourth High Steward of Scotland, dies in the intervening year, and his son, the James Stuart, takes over. And luckily, though, for them, King Haakon dies too in that intervening year. So lucky for Scotland, they beat him and then didn't have to fight him again. His son says, actually, I will sell these islands to you. I don't care about the gold price. So only 3 years later, he sells it. And King Magnus, that's this guy's name, the son of King Haakon. He ended up being called King Magnus the Lawmender. And he went on to focus on fighting Sweden, who also had a King Magnus at the time. So, but that's the last Magnus we have to deal with for now. So that's it. 500 years of Norse rule was overthrown by these pair of Alexanders, Alexander the King and Alexander the Fourth High Steward of Scotland. So that's pretty cool.
I think it's worth pointing out here that the official Norse ruler might be gone, but Norse influence had become pervasive through
so many
Scotland
people live in
England
there,
and France and all over the place. Yeah. So
yeah, they were there. Their influence was there. They just weren't ruling anymore. That's probably a better way to put it. Yeah, good clarification. So let's talk a little bit about Alexander III. When he defeated King Haakon, he was only 22. So that's a really good start. And with James Stuart, the fifth High Steward of Scotland's help, the son of Alexander, his reign was very successful. To maintain peace with his southern neighbors, his father had married him to Margaret of England, the sister of a certain Prince Edward, who's going to be huge in this story. And this Margaret was a daughter of Henry III of England, so she was a member of House Plantagenet. So this happened when he was 11 and she was 10. And eventually when they were around 20, they had a daughter who was also called Margaret. And she was called Margaret of Scotland. Now, then they had an Alexander, a son. So yes, Margaret and Alexander had Margaret and Alexander. Then Alexander becomes the heir, of course, because he's the boy. And then 8 years later, there's a son named David. So the perfect number of children in some ways, right? You got your heir to spare, and a girl to form an alliance with, to marry into another family. That's how they would have looked at it anyway. So King Alexander and Queen Margaret attend the coronation of her brother after the death of King Henry III. Now I'll tell you who that is. Edward Longshanks, a.k.a. Tywin Lannister. Yes, George has been very open about comparing him to Tywin Lannister. He's the number one influence. And if you think that Longshanks is going to have a peaceful relationship with Scotland, let me remind you, or inform you if you didn't know already, that one of his nicknames was the Hammer of the Scots. Yes, not because he was friendly to them. Yes, hammers, you don't hammer people you're friends with, I don't think. Certain euphemisms, maybe.
Oh, it wasn't like the Scots were using him as a tool.
Oh, hey, good one. So Edward, you might remember him from as the English king in Braveheart, and yeah, that might remind you of the kind of guy he was, and that's fairly accurate. Yeah, very Tywin-esque. He had already conquered Wales by the time, so he was already very, very impressive figure. He was tall, 6'2". That's where the name Longshanks comes from. He had become king in 1272, about 9 years after Scotland defeated the Norse. He was on crusade when he became king, and not long before he became king, he was attacked by the Order of Assassins. They tried to assassinate him, the actual original assassins from Syria, the Ismaili group. And King Edward actually fought off the assassin and killed him, but not before the assassin poisoned him. Poison didn't kill Edward. He was able to get home, was crowned a full year and a half later after returning from the Holy Land. So Alexander III was the brother by marriage to Edward Longshanks. And this is good because you don't want that guy as an enemy. So as long as you're married to his family, that's a buffer, right? Unfortunately, this buffer fell apart kind of fast. Queen Margaret died the year after Edward was crowned. So, well, his sister's out of the way, but he still has, nephews and a niece, right? So there's still that. 6 years later, in the year 1281, Alexander shored up those relations with Norway by marrying Margaret of Scotland, his daughter, to King Magnus the Lawmender's son and heir, Eric. So here we see a difference in marriages because she was married a little later than you would expect, but not a big deal here. Very soon after this marriage, the real disaster unfolded for Alexander's heirs. They'd already lost their mother in 1275, and though Alexander slept around a lot, he didn't remarry. So Prince David dies in 1281, the same year that his sister marries into the Norse throne. So this is the year 1281 still. The following year, Alexander marries his son Alexander to another Margaret of Flanders. Margaret of Scotland dies giving birth to her son with Eric, and the daughter is called Margaret. It's already so many Margarets. And she's...
So that's the daughter, the daughter-in-law, and the granddaughter are all named Margaret, right?
Yes, yeah. And there's probably some more Margarets here and there that we haven't... Yeah, and the other wife of the brother, so to son Alexander, Prince Alexander. So to distinguish her from the other, she's the Maid of Norway. That's a name very familiar to A Song of Ice and Fire. Margaret, the Maid of Norway. The following year, though, the heir, Prince Alexander, dies. So he's gone, and they waited a little while to see if Margaret of Flanders was pregnant, because if she had a kid, then that would be the heir, but she was not. So this is very much a Jaehaerys and Alysanne situation. Alexander III outlives his wife and all his children, leading to an eventual Great Council type situation, and which we'll get to in a second. This is tragic as well for Scotland, because all of a sudden, all the people related to Edward Longshanks in the royal family are dead. So all of a sudden, he can go, now I can maybe think about invading or come after you in some way, exercise my authority. And of course, that's exactly what he did. But Scotland saw this coming, or at least was worried about this possibility. So in 1284, Alexander III induces the Parliament of Scotland to accept this granddaughter, the Maid of Norway, as his heir presumptive. Even though she lives in Norway, even though she's, product of Norwegian influence and all that, they're like, well, this is the only kid we've got. Let's go with her. And to strengthen that claim and to reestablish relationship with England, they married her to King Edward's heir, Prince Edward, who would eventually be Edward II. Not for a long time, though. Now you'd say, wait a minute.
I'm sure they're fully in love, too, right?
Oh, they're fully in love, yes. At this very early age. Margaret of Norway is about, 7 at this time? 8? So, yeah, not very old. Now, you would think, wait, did he really just marry his only heir to the throne, the Prince of England? Wouldn't that mean her lands go to their children? And that gives Edward Longshanks what he wants? They're just going to give the throne of Scotland through marriage? No. The marriage pact had a specific carve-out for that it would not pass to England. The question is, would Edward Longshanks actually obey this? Maybe, maybe not. At the time, they said, well, maybe the best course of action is to not tempt fate and just, King Alexander, you're not that old. Just remarry. Maybe you can have a son or more daughters or something, and that'll solve this problem altogether. So that's what he does. He remarries to a woman named Yolande of Dreux. Probably said that wrong. She's French. I don't speak French. But Alexander then pulls a Balon Greyjoy / Luthor Tyrell. Oh boy. He was brave. Brave guy. He fought in that war. He did a lot of stuff, but maybe too brave. On March 19th, 1286, he rode off at night during a storm because March 20th, the next day, was going to be Yolanda's birthday. He didn't want to miss her birthday, right? You got to be there for your new wife's birthday, even if you're riding in the storm and darkness, which his counselors had repeatedly told him not to do. So what does he do? I told you Luthor Tyrell. I told you Balon Greyjoy. That's right. He went right off a cliff. He rode right off a cliff in the rain and darkness, broke his neck in the earldom of Fife at a place called Kinghorn. Yeah, Kinghorn, or in this case, King fall and break his neck. So that was a problem. So whoops, lots of oopsies here, lots of people dying, and all of a sudden you've got a big problem. So what happens next? It's called the Great Cause. At the beginning, I mentioned that the Great Cause is pretty much the Great Council. Yeah, that's right. It pretty much is the Great Council. Now, because there's no obvious ruler at this point, you've got the Guardians of Scotland who come forward. They are regents. This is very much like the regency of Aegon III, or perhaps some other regencies where the regents weren't very kind to each other. They didn't exactly work together that well. In some cases, they killed each other or tried to kill each other. There's a little Unwin Peake in here, or maybe a lot. There were 6 of these guys with rotations at the top, like meaning who was in charge of them changed and changed quickly. The first primary regent was Duncan III, Earl of Fife. This is exactly the place where the king fell to his death. But that's just a coincidence. Now, well, probably. Is it? Yeah. They summoned the storm and darkness that killed him. Yeah, that's right. Now, they were the second most powerful at the realm in the time. Eventually, that's going to be the Stuarts, and they're going to take more than just their position of prominence. They're going to take their position as the people who are able to use the Stone of Scone, aka the Stone of Destiny, which is a coronation tool or coronation artifact. Whenever a new king of Scotland was crowned, they would use the Stone of Destiny. And this stone remains a part of the story going forward.
Real quick, I want to say something about that.
Yeah, do it.
At first, I thought this was a stone, like, maybe the size of a baseball or something. It's huge. It's like 2 feet by 1 foot by 1 foot. It weighs like over 300 pounds. It's huge.
Wow.
And it still exists today. Eventually, it got incorporated into the British throne that they crowned the king on. They built a chair around this stone. King Charles last year sat on that stone to be crowned King of England. Yeah,
pretty amazing.
It's got a bunch of other stories around it too. It got blown up in a terrorist attack by suffrage rights activists at one point, and got stolen by these Scottish students to bring it back from England to Scotland, and all sorts of history around that.
I've got a few more details about the Stone of Scone, rather. It was called the Scone of Stone in Terry Pratchett. He reversed it, so that's why I said that. No, actually, I said that by accident and then just kind of pivoted to that. But really, the Stone of Scone, we'll have a little bit more about that at the end, too, and a little more in the middle. Now, but so Duncan the Third here is on his way to the capital to do his business, ruling as this, as one of the most powerful men in Scotland at the time, and his own kin murder him. They just kill him. They're like, nope, not for you. That made his baby son Duncan the Fourth the new Earl of Fife, but you can't be coronating people and wielding the Stone of Scone when you're a baby. So his responsibilities were handed off, and that was prestige for a different family. But we're going to come back to Duncan the Fourth later when he's an adult. The next head regent was a guy named Alexander Comyn. Now, the Comyns are going to be pretty big in the story, too. He had been Alexander III's chief counselor, so he was in good with the king and was well respected. But he was also dead within a year. So we have a regent who rules for less than a year, killed by his own family, then another regent who dies, and we're not really sure why. He may have just died of old age. James Stuart, the fifth High Steward, now becomes the chief regent. So that guy had been around and had been effective even after taking over for his father, who was another Alexander. Now, along with James Stuart, there's another Alexander, the son of the Alexander Comyn that we just mentioned, Black John Comyn. So the last four regents are James Stuart, fifth High Steward, Black John Comyn, and two bishops named Robert and William. And Robert in particular is going to be important. Now let's talk about the Douglases for a minute. A little Douglas interlude, we'll say. The Lord Douglas of this time was called Sir William the Bold. Yes, not to be confused with Barristan the Bold, or actually, go right ahead and confuse him for Barristan the Bold if you want to. He had married Elizabeth Stuart, the daughter of Alexander, the fourth High Steward who led the Scottish armies against the Norse. She seems to have died back in 1288. But not before Alexander Stuart and her had a kid named James. James, a new one. Yes, that's right. This James is remembered by the English as the Black Douglas. And he's remembered by the Scottish as Good Sir James. So it's really all about where you're sitting, because to the Scots, he was a hero. To the James, he was like, to the English, he was like a boogeyman of sorts. Like the Black Douglas will come get you. And as we go through the story, you'll see why he has that reputation. Now, a little confusion, because there are the Black Douglases, which is a branch of the Douglas family that forms from his descendants. But he's the Black Douglas. It's not exactly the same thing. Anyway, this guy, after his wife, Elizabeth Stuart, dies, decides he needs to remarry, because he's only got one James as a son. You need more than that. You need multiple Jameses and Williams to survive in this environment, right? So he needs more kids. He abducts a woman named Eleanor de Louvain, and it's a mystery. It's like, how did Aegon the Uncrowned and his wife Rhaena, how did they get their dragons when they were out in the field and they snuck back into King's Landing? Somehow they got their dragons to fight against Maegor. We don't know how that happened. It was some amazing adventure that George has yet to describe. Similar case here. This guy marries Eleanor, even though at the time she was besieged by a different army in a castle. Right, she's stuck in a castle with a besieging army around, and he has nothing to do with this army. Yet somehow she escapes this castle and is his prisoner. Now, prisoner, I'm using finger quotes to describe, because it seems like she was in on this or wanted it or something, because A, he was punished for it, for kidnapping her, but she bailed him out. So that tells you something. And he was then allowed to marry her, which is like, usually you're not allowed to marry people you kidnap, but I mean, this is a different time and place, right? But King Edward Longshanks was not happy about all this. Even though he has no authority here, he ordered his land seized, which he did actually have some authority, because the Douglases had English lands and Scottish lands. So he said, hey, your English lands, were taking that, and I want those two delivered to me, because he didn't approve of this marriage. He didn't approve of any of this. But the Guardians of Scotland just said, they said nothing, actually. They just didn't do it. So Edward got mad and waited for an opportunity to get his revenge. And he did get it. Now, with her, with Eleanor, the Black Douglas had a son called Hugh Douglas, who was called Hugh the Dull. Now, it's not very nice to call him Hugh the Dull. He wasn't stupid. He was a cleric. He was a priest. So he was boring. That was the idea. They called him dull because he was boring. But more importantly, he had another son called Sir Archibald Douglas, the man from whom the Red Douglases would descend. So this again is William the Bold has the Black Douglas, the future Red Douglas, and Hugh the Dull in between them, right? So William the Bold had a back and forth relationship with Longshanks, mostly back, as you can see. He's already mad at him for the kidnapping and this marriage and not being seized when he was ordered. And this is going to be a thing going forward. So the Scottish nobility is like, all right, there's still no more options. Alexander III is dead. His widow didn't have a child. She was, she does have a child. Wait, no, she doesn't. She's pregnant, but the child is stillborn. So that's no good. So they go ahead with Margaret, as in the Maid of Norway, to be the queen. Heir presumptive. Maybe something will change. Maybe something else will change. Not heir presumptive, but maybe something else will happen. But she's the only one they have. So
what's the timing here? How old is she at this point? Do you know?
She's 7. Yeah.
Still a child.
Yeah,
okay.
She's 7 years old, very young. So they agree, and I mean a majority of Scottish nobles, but enough of them are not happy about this, including Robert de Bruce. Not Robert the Bruce, his father, Robert de Bruce, right? The Bruce and de Bruce. Like there's the French version and the not. One is the father, one is the son. The famous one is the son. This is the father, Robert de Bruce, and his friends go to the spot where they're planning to inaugurate Margaret and just camp out there with soldiers because they aren't going to allow this to happen. They're like, nope, you will not crown her. Turns out they didn't have to bother because on the ship or on the road, not entirely clear where, but on the way from Norway, she dies. There's no evidence of foul play. It's not even suggested. But
she rode her horse off a cliff.
Yeah. She blew her ship. She blew her ship off a cliff. The world was flat back then, let's not forget. So it's pretty suspicious, but I don't know that Edward Longshanks could have murdered her from that far away. It's possible. Maybe someone loyal to him. I don't know. There's definitely reason to be suspicious. He's the beneficiary, and it throws Scotland into chaos. So here's where it becomes the Great Council of 101 situation, because they have to go, well, who's going to be king now? And they decide, okay, let's not fight over it if possible. If possible. They try not to fight over it. And the idea is, okay, we'll just put forth, anyone who wants to come forward with a claim can say, all right, I want you all to examine my legal claim, and then eventually going to figure out who has the best claim, and that person's going to be king. 14 people came forward. It's a very similar number to how many came forward in the Great Council of 101. One of them was actually the King Eric of Norway. He's like, yeah, my daughter was going to be king or queen. Why not me? Like, well, you have no relation to any of this anymore, King Eric. But that's the medieval mindset. And the foremost ones were John Balliol and that same Robert de Bruce. So you kind of can see why Robert de Bruce didn't want Margaret crowned, because he wanted it for himself, right? So did this John Balliol character. And, well, let's go back to a quote from George. Here we go.
When Alexander III, King of Scots, rode over a cliff and Margaret, the Maid of Norway, died en route back home, and the Scottish lords called on Edward I of England to decide who had the best claim to the throne, something like 14 or 15, I need to look up the exact number, competitors came forward to present their pedigrees and documents to the court. The decision eventually boiled down to precedence, John Balliol versus proximity, Bruce, and went to Balliol. But those other 13 guys all had claims as well. King Eric of Norway, for instance, based his claim to the throne on his daughter, the aforementioned Maid of Norway, who had been the queen, however briefly. He seemed to believe that inheritance should run backwards. And hell, if he had been the king of France instead of the king of Norway, maybe it would have. The medieval world was governed by men, not by laws. You could even make a case that the lords preferred the laws to be vague and contradictory, since that gave them more power.
Great insight by George there. It both tells you how he operates as a writer and how the real world operated then and now. Yes, people can be above the law. Laws are for people who aren't above them. And usually the nobles are above them, especially these most powerful of nobles. There's always ways to get around. Sometimes it's difficult. You've got the Pope and other lords and laws that to contend with, but you can see that even those things can be overcome. So as George said, Edward Longshanks is invited by many Scottish lords, not all, but many, to administer, but not adjudicate the situation, right? There's a very fine line they're walking with a very dangerous, ambitious man. And indeed, as soon as he's brought in, he's like, all right, if you want me to do this, you guys will have to be my vassals. All of Scotland has to be my vassal. They're like, that's exactly what we didn't want to do. And he tries to force the issue. And here's where we get the Harold Westerling on TV argument. Remember what happened on House of the Dragon? Harold Westerling is ordered by Otto to go kill Rhaenyra and her children. He says, I'm a Kingsguard, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. The only person who can give me an order is the king. There's no king. I don't have to listen to any of you. See you later. Now, they couldn't just walk away from Edward because they're in their own country. But they did make a similar argument. It's like, look, Edward, the only one who can give you what you want is the king, and we don't have a king. Only the king's order would be valid. Only the king can do homage to you, and we don't have one. So we can't agree to that. If we make a king and he agrees to that, then maybe. But we can't agree to that. We lack the authority. We can't. It's not our place. It's a pretty good argument, but of course it annoys the heck out of Edward, and he doesn't exactly give up. So yeah, it's 1292 that John Balliol is chosen king, as George pointed out in the quote there, 6 years after Alexander's death. So they went 6 years without a king. And even this doesn't go very well, because a lot of people are like, screw this Balliol guy. We don't agree with it. William Douglas the Bold doesn't show up for the first parliament, and neither does Robert de Bruce, which really both undermines John Balliol's authority and gets them in trouble with John and with King Edward.
One little side note here I found interesting was the council, the people making this decision. It was 40 people picked by Balliol, 40 people picked by Bruce, and 24 people picked by Edward. There was 104 people. I don't know where they come up with those numbers and how the other 12 or whatever claimants didn't get to pick any of the people involved. But I think that would be as interesting as anything to learn about how and who those individuals were. But
yeah, I agree. So next is the Old Alliance, our next section. Edward Longshanks finally just went too far. He kept ordering the Scots around. He made John Balliol go to court in England over some kind of trivial matter. It was very embarrassing for a king to be summoned to do a minor legal matter in another country. But he went because he didn't want to upset Edward. But finally, Edward ordered Scotland to just provide military support for his war in France. And finally they balked. Not only did they balk, they formed the Old Alliance with France that was a mutual pact against England. This was huge. This is like Mance Rayder signing a deal with Tywin Lannister, right? Or Balon Greyjoy with Tywin, because this is a very small country. Scotland is not powerful. Scotland at this point is particularly small and not well regarded on the international stage, right? They didn't have a lot of regional power. They were mostly just controlled by these outside nations. This is starting to change. And this is a big sign of that. Yes, the deal heavily favored France as a result of France being the much more powerful half of this partnership. But the deal was with Iron King Philip IV. This is the guy that ended the Templars. This is the guy that starts the Accursed King series that we've referenced so many times. This was Philip the Fair. He was an incredibly powerful king. So to be dealing with this John Balliol guy who was not even like well invested, like a lot of the Scottish lords weren't even following his authority. So it was a pretty big deal. And the reason I bring up Tywin, not only because the deal was against Edward, but because Tywin actually says this. Remember, there's a council meeting in, I think, A Clash of Kings, but it must be A Storm of Swords. Definitely A Storm of Swords, where they're talking about the fact that Mance Rayder is invading the North. And they're like, maybe we should have a deal with him. And Tywin's like, we don't have to have a deal with him. He's doing what we want. We'll just let him do that. We don't have to have a deal. Why give him anything? He's already doing what we want. And then he made the same point about Balon Greyjoy. He's like, Balon Greyjoy is attacking the North. He wants to deal with us. Let's see how well he does. If he gets a little farther, maybe then we'll make a deal with him, which eventually Tywin does suggest marrying Cersei to Balon, which, of course, Cersei and many others are like, no, please don't do that. And then Tywin dies, so it doesn't happen. But similar point here. Iron King Philip maybe didn't really need Scotland as an ally, maybe didn't really care. He couldn't really hurt him, but it could only help. It's the same thing. They're totally willing to use Scotland, and if they got more out of it, great. If not, no big deal. They're still going to have to fight England. So here's a line from George, just a single line. He said, certainly the policies Edward followed, Tywin would have approved of. So yeah, this goes to show, right? So Edward responded to the old alliance by invading, and he takes the town of Berwick on Tweed, where he killed a lot of citizens, a massacre. This was actually portrayed in Braveheart. It just so happens that Berwick was governed by William Douglas the Bold, the very guy that Edward had ordered seized, but was not seized. So he goes right for his lands when he invades. This time Edward had him, though, because Douglas was brave and he wasn't going to abandon his lands. He defends the city and is captured. He is forced to sign a new oath to Edward, and then he just kind of breaks the deal. The Battle of Dunbar happens. England wins that easily, takes the capital, and takes the Stone of Destiny. No! Edward seizes the Stone of Destiny. James, the 5th High Steward of Scotland at this point, who's still around, he's going to be around for a while, he says, this is going very badly. We can't beat Edward. He surrenders. The rest of the Scottish nobility basically follows his lead and says, yeah, well, if he's not fighting, and we're not fighting either. King John Balliol is forced into a very humiliating surrender. He has to stand in front of Edward with his coat, with all its sigils and all the heraldry, in front of all these English nobles while they rip the sigils off his coat. To this day, he's known as Empty Coat. Tomb Tabard. Yes. People still call him that to this day. He was eventually imprisoned in the Tower of London, and then eventually after that sent to live out his days as a rich but obscure person, and he's out of the story.
Worth noting, this is another example of someone you almost just expected they would execute, but they didn't.
Yeah.
Like, he's an adult, he's the king, but they want to remove him. You would think they would remove his line. They might even kill his kids. You can imagine all kinds of, but nah. Just don't bother. Just stay out of the picture and everything will be okay.
And indeed, his son is going to enter the picture at some point. But before that, Edward says, all right, I conquered Scotland. It's done. It was not done. However, he did take the Stone of Destiny to London and then went to France, where he continued warring and ordered many Scottish lords, who he considered his vassals now, to follow him there. Most did, because they were still scared of this guy for good reason. He was intimidating, capable, and had a lot more soldiers and money than they did. But some of them still just didn't obey. William the Bold just said no. He just didn't show up. He just said, I'm going to stay here, and we'll see what happens. Bishop Robert, that same Bishop Robert who was one of the counselors, he also refused, just didn't show up.
Another little footnote, I think, I meant to mention this earlier, but that's part of why Douglas the Black got that name. It's because Scotland was usually fighting from a disadvantage. Like England just had way more supplies, population, infrastructure, and so on. And so Scotland would use like guerrilla tactics, right? They wouldn't like march up troops in the middle of the field to fight at 9 a.m. You know, they would attack on the roads, little skirmishes and guerrilla tactic type stuff. And it was like Black Douglas. It was like unfair. It's like, he's bringing us doom, you know. But of course, the Scotland's think he was Douglas the Good. Yeah, or you're beating the English. You know? So,
yep, it's very true that guerrilla tactics were what they had to work with. They couldn't face the English directly, kind of like America. We couldn't face the English either directly. We had to do guerrilla tactics. Different style of guerrilla tactics, gunpowder era, but similar line of thinking. This is very much Aegon the First, or Daeron the First, thinking, hey, I conquered Dorne. I installed some people, now I can go elsewhere. But as soon as he left, they rose up. And that's exactly what happened here. As soon as Edward went to France, they were like, aha, he's embroiled with the French. That's a really powerful army. That's a really powerful nation he's fighting. This is our chance to rise up. Edward, of course, would not forgive or forget that they rose up while he was engaged. So they rise up. This is when Andrew Moray and then William Wallace emerges as leaders. The movie was accurate in one way in that William Wallace did start off by killing a sheriff. The reason for killing that sheriff was not because they killed his wife, but whatever. Edward was too busy in France. He orders Robert the Bruce to go back to England, or Scotland rather, and deal with the Douglas. So Robert the Bruce gets some men together, goes to the Douglas lands, and when he gets there, he's like, I'm here to join you. So he just flips and says, I'm on your side. We're told he had like a crisis of conscience. Who knows what really happened? Maybe he planned all along. He's like, all right, here's my chance. It's portrayed that he was, conflicted about it until he got there. But who knows what really happened. Anyway, the first noble supporter of William Wallace and Andrew Moray was William the Bold. He immediately broke that oath of fealty. He's like, yeah, I took an oath to the King of England, but my oath to Scotland is stronger. It's very much a Jaime Lannister, like a oath conundrum. He's like, yeah, I took an oath, but I took this oath too. And they, so yeah, I love that. The conflicting oaths comes up big here. I don't suppose he was really that conflicted about it, but he's able to say that, So Robert the Bruce is only 22 years old at this point. He's one of the first other nobles to join. And quickly, Moray and Wallace win the Battle of Stirling Bridge, which is portrayed in Braveheart, though without a bridge. It's just the Battle of Stirling. I don't know. They didn't call it anything. Anyway, they win that battle, but shortly after, Lord William is captured again. This time, he doesn't get out of prison. They mistreat him in jail, and he dies the following year in 1298. But his heirs would cause all sorts of problems. This is the father of the Black Douglas, not the Black Douglas. Now the Black Douglas is going to get going. But back in 1298, Edward won a political victory. He actually got the King of France to agree to a truce, and in that deal, they just cut Scotland out. They were like, well, see what I said before? Like, the king didn't have to necessarily give Scotland what he wanted because they were the more powerful end of the partnership here. And in fact, it was no longer the Iron King in charge anyway. So Edward just reinvades Scotland now that he has a truce with France. This happens at the same time William Wallace is knighted. William Wallace is named Guardian of the Kingdom of Scotland. There's some evidence, actually, William was ruling in a non-military capacity. See this title over the whole country. But interestingly, when Edward later conquered it again or won several battles, he destroyed a lot of the records. This is maybe why we're missing some of the other records as well. Anyway, Edward defeated William at Falkirk. William escaped, but resigned his post because no one trusted him as a military leader anymore. He had failed, and they were like, well, we got to go with somebody else. The Pope said, Edward, stop doing this. But he didn't. Wallace instead goes to France, starts trying to recruit instead. Since he's no longer a general, he's a recruiter. Robert the Bruce and John the Third Common, we had John the Second Common, the Black. Now we have John the Third Common, the Red, were now the joint guardians. But they just couldn't get along. Finally, another letter from the Pope came, and Edward backed off a little bit. And then Robert resigned as Guardian of Scotland, and then John the Red resigned as Guardian of Scotland. So things are really changing quickly here. Edward again invades a few years later and brings his son, Prince Edward, the future King Edward II, to get him some experience, to win him some glory. He gives his son the bigger army. He's like, go do this. And it doesn't work. He's just not, he's, in many ways, Edward II was considered a great prince, but he was a horrible military leader and a horrible politician. So I don't exactly know what they were talking about. No, he was good at he was like courtly behavior and music and other stuff, but he wasn't good at ruling or managing other nobles and stuff like that. So he's still fighting, even though Edward does a poor job. King Edward does a good job continuously. And Robert just finally says, I give up. I surrender. We don't know why. Maybe it was a stratagem. Maybe he was tired of seeing his people die. His father, remember the old guy that's giving Robert the Bruce advice and telling him what to do? That was fairly accurate. The things he was telling him to do weren't accurate, but Robert de Bruce was still alive. He was just infirm. So Robert the Bruce was out there doing stuff while his father is still lying in bed. But in the movie, he's like, we got to bend the knee and then we can come back, which is pretty much what happens. So that at least is semi-accurate. Now, Edward wanted to make examples out of some of the leadership, and that was William Wallace. William Wallace is the guy that was made an example of. At one point, he ordered the Scottish nobles. He's like, look, you guys hand over William Wallace or none of you get your lands back. Like, I'm going to take all your lands away. So this included the 5th High Steward James and John Comyn the Red. It's not super clear whether they participated or how much they participated or just acted like they were helping flush Wallace out. Wallace was a controversial figure even amongst Scots, especially the nobility. He was captured in 1305 and executed actually more brutally than they showed in the movie. I was like, wow, it was worse. Now, just prior to William's execution, Robert the Bruce secretly engaged Bishop William Lamberton, and they had a pact. They're like, all right, we're going to free Scotland one day, and we're going to bide our time until Edward dies. He's old. We're not going to go up against that guy again. He's too formidable. So we'll just bide our time, work together behind the scenes, and when he dies, we'll rise up. Now, this isn't exactly how it went, but that was the idea. Now, John the Red finds out about this, and he says, hey, you guys making a deal without me? I want in. And so Robert's like, okay, I'll make a deal with you too. Let's support each other's claims. One of us is going to become king. The other one gets the other's lands. Now, there's some evidence that John took this deal and maybe decided to go tell King Edward about it to get his side to work out and to kind of cut Robert back out of the deal. Robert found out about it and didn't let John know he found out about it. He arranged to meet John at a church because they needed neutral ground. The two of these guys didn't really like each other that much, even though they had this deal. They had fought before. There was a lot of bad blood, mutual ambition. You know, they're a little maybe too much alike in some ways.
So church is neutral ground. They'll be safe there.
Yeah, right? What could go wrong? They're in a church. Like, no one ever kills someone else in a church. Robert kills John Comyn in the church, stabs him to death.
Music.
Yeah, exactly. And he would have been excommunicated. Really, like, that's what should have happened. The Pope, like, basically ordered this, but Bishop Lamberton and Bishop Robert Wishart are like, no, we're not going to excommunicate Robert. He's our hero. He's the guy that's going to be our king. That's still their plan. So that's what happened. Instead of being excommunicated, he's crowned. They make him Robert the First of Scotland. Yay, Robert. King Robert. Now, what does England say about this? They say, that's not a king. He's Robert the Bruce. He's not a king. No, we don't recognize Robert as king. So this is the year, what is it, 1305 or 6 anyway? So he declares himself. His first campaign is a disaster. He gets a lot of men. He loses the Battle of Methven, and his family is captured. Like his sisters, his daughters, everybody. His brothers were caught, and those 3 were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Bad news. Awful. They got the William Wallace treatment. And his other family are treated in a variety of embarrassing ways. One of them was put in a cage outside a castle and left there every day for 4 years. That's his sister Marjorie. And Marjorie's going to be important later. So here's where we get the spider story, though. This is a little bit like Ned Stark. Remember when Ned Stark was in prison and Varys comes to talk to him and he won't bend until Sansa's brought up? Well, there's no spider in that one except Varys himself. Here there's an actual, we're told there's an actual spider, and it's probably a legend, but Robert saw this. He's hiding in the Scottish forests. He's penniless and decrepit at this point and doesn't know if he's got any future left. He sees this spider making a web. The spider's web gets broken by the wind or the rain, and the spider just starts over again. He just perseveres. He keeps going. He just keeps on going. Like Varys said, keep on paddling, right? Robert is apparently inspired by this. He's like, that spider didn't give up. Neither am I. I'm going for it. A year later, he reemerges from hiding, and again, the Scots flock to his banners. This time, it goes really well because Edward is sick. They know he's going to die. It's unlikely he's going to recover. And then as Robert gains momentum, winning some battles, Edward does finally die. And more men join Robert. Like, oh, it's going even better. Let's join up now. Edward died, and it was placed in his tomb. And his tomb to this day contains a vow to revenge himself on Robert the Bruce. And this is where the nickname Hammer of the Scots comes from. Around this time was the incident of the Douglas Larder. Okay? This was maybe 1307 or maybe 1308. It was on Palm Sunday. So again, using the religious holidays or the church or this moment to attack when it's least expected. So the Black Douglas is now becoming prominent. Remember, this is the son of William the Bold, the oldest son of William the Bold, also known. The Black Douglas, also known, of course, as Good Sir James, as Sean pointed out, right? So when everyone's at church, he bursts in with his men, and they shout, a Douglas, which is, like a griffin, like the Conningtons, right? They killed the English soldiers of the garrison, cut off their heads, threw them all in a pile, and burned the pile. And then they put salt in the wells and dead horse parts in the wells to ruin the wells. So why was this called the Douglas Larder? Was it because the Douglases did it? Well, yes, partly. But it was against his own castle. The English held his castle, and he did this to his own castle. He's like, no, if I can't use it, neither can you. That's the kind of enemy you're dealing with here. This is what Edward has to deal with, and this is the man that is Good Sir James, aka the Black Douglas. He is not willing to give an inch, and this becomes very characteristic of Scottish warfare against the English. It kind of already was, but it goes up a notch or several notches in that their goal is to deny the English anything. If they take a castle, they're going to burn that castle. If you're going to come into our territory, we're going to burn the land so you can't have any farmland. If we're going to leave these wells behind, we're going to poison them so your men can't drink out of them. If we can't have it, no one can. Yes, that's the idea. I think that was Edinburgh Castle, if I remember correctly. Apparently we're supposed to pronounce it Edinburgh. Edinburgh. It has a very storied history. It's one of the most assaulted locations on Earth over the centuries and one of the most continuously occupied locations in Europe. So, now, the following year, in 1309, our good friend James Stuart, the 5th High Steward of Scotland, who's still around after all this, well, he finally isn't. He passes, and his son, Walter, became the 6th High Steward of Scotland. Because it's a hereditary title, like the Tyrells. This is a problem, though, because this Walter was 13. The High Steward of Scotland, during a time of war, is 13 years old. He didn't actually carry out his duties. He just had the title, and other people kind of did it for him. So that they did have a solution for these kind of issues. Now, fast forward 4 more years. Robert the Bruce declares that any Scottish lord who still supports John Balliol or anyone else, because even though Balliol was out of the picture, there are people still loyal to him or holding out for his family or whatever. He says, if you don't support me, your lands are forfeit. So that really got a few people off the couch to join him and a few others to go deeper into Edward's side, shall we say, because again, we're in Edward II now. It's still Edward. Now, remember we had Edward IV as the Robert Baratheon parallel, and we have Edward I here. We're going to get all the way back to that. Not that Edward IV will be in here, but we're going to have Edward II and Edward III. So all the Edwards are covered here. In 1314, the famous Battle of Bannockburn was won by Robert. In this battle, John Comyn IV, we already had John II, the Black, John III, the Red. Robert had stripped his lands back when, a while back, because they're still enemies. And John Comyn was for the English in hopes of getting his land back, but he was killed in a cavalry charge. And they ceased to be a player in this game. Robert himself fought very hard. At one point, he was charged by a certain Sir Henry de Bohun, Earl of Hereford. It's a real strong Belwas moment. Robert only had an axe. And Henry had a lance. The guy comes right at him with a lance, and Robert stands his ground. He was actually on a small horse, but he still stood his ground on that horse. So with the lance coming right at him, like Osnak Zopal coming right at him, he does the strong Belwas move and just dodges the point of the lance and then axes Hugh in the face. Henry, not Hugh, in the face. And he was very nonchalant about it. He just cuts this guy's head. He chops this guy's face with his axe. And he's like, I broke my favorite axe. Dang it. So this guy's quite a tough one. Now, they beat Edward II's army. He has to retreat. And there's this guy named Gilles de Argentin. He's another Frenchman whose name I have butchered probably. He was considered the third best knight in all the realms, in all of Europe. He was a Norman fighting for Edward. His job was to make sure the king was safe. So the king is retreating. He helps the king retreat. And then he says, you know what, king, your retreat appears to be safe. I don't retreat, so I'm going back. So he goes back and dies. The point of this is because it's a crazy story, but also, well, who were the other two greatest knights? Well, you said third greatest. Well, who were the top two? Henry, the Holy Roman Emperor, not a part of the story other than this moment, and Robert the Bruce. So Robert the Bruce was that famous, that well regarded, even before his strong Belwas moment, apparently. So after all this, Robert wins this stirring victory, and it gives him negotiating power because he captures a lot of nobles, and he's able to get his family out, plus Bishop Wishart. He gets all these people freed from prison, including Marjorie, the one who had 4 years of solitary confinement. And Marjorie is released from prison, and she's picked up by escort by Walter Stuart, this man who's now a few years older. He's no longer a 13-year-old. He's only about maybe 17 now. And they get to talking, and then they get to marrying. So Walter Stuart marries Marjorie Bruce. You can see how they're getting into the royal family now, right? Here's another little parallel. Even though the Battle of Bannockburn is maybe the most famous battle in Scottish history, certainly the most famous in this period of time, they don't know where it is. They don't know where it happened. There's monuments. They're not exactly in the right spot because they don't know where that was. Very similar to the Red Grass Field of Blackfyre Rebellion fame. We don't know where that was. We have some ideas, we have some guesses, but we don't actually know. There was some campaigning in Ireland. Robert tried to install his brother, another gosh darn Edward Bruce, as the High King of Ireland. But Edward Bruce was a real glory hound, maybe, or maybe a guy who didn't like the Stuarts. Maybe he didn't like the fact that his sister or his niece was married to a Stuart, the brother of 5th Stuart James, so the uncle of this current Walter Stuart. John Stuart brings an army to Ireland to help Edward Bruce win against the English. But Edward's like, I don't want your help. And he starts his battle before John arrives and loses. So he really should have waited for that help. Even though Edward Bruce was killed in this battle, it was still effective for the Scottish because Ireland was just used as a recruiting ground for soldiers to send against Scotland. And that stopped with this. Edward Bruce was also the lieutenant to Robert, his brother. And with his death, the new guardian of the realm, the new lieutenant to Robert the Bruce is the Black Douglas. Meanwhile, while all this Irish business is happening, Marjorie was thrown from her horse, but pregnant with Walter Stuart's son. She either died right after falling or during. It's not clear. Either way, the better version of the story, meaning the more interesting, is that the fall from the horse triggered the premature birth of her son. Of course, they named the son Robert after Robert the Bruce. And this boy became the presumptive heir to Robert the Bruce because he didn't have any actual sons of his own, so he now has a grandson. And that's his presumptive heir for a few years. In late 1318, the Black Douglas becomes this young Robert's tutor. Yeah. And just before that, the Black Douglas fought a guy named Sir Robert Neville, the Peacock of the North, and defeated him in single combat. Oh. His skills, Sean mentioned earlier how guerrilla warfare was becoming a Scottish thing. They just kept getting better and better at it. Eventually, by the end of the story, they're going to have like hundreds of years of practice at this. You got to imagine they were really, really good at it. Yeah, the American revolutionaries were good at it, but they only had to be good at it for a few years, and then they won, and that was it. Then you got America, and it's done. Like, they don't have to do that kind of guerrilla fighting anymore. These guys did it for generations. They must have been amazing at it. Yeah. But it was also really a brutal style of war because, yes, this scorched earth policy was pretty tough on the locals too, right? You're burning, those are our own farms we're burning, our own wells we're denying. So this is where I compare the Black Douglas to the Blackfish, because that is what the Blackfish wanted to do. He wanted to burn all the land around River Run so that the Lannisters wouldn't have a lot of food to besiege them. And that, well, he didn't just want to, he did do that. there's a lot, and you can see the combination of skills that the Blackfish has. Blackfish was amazing at scouting and raiding and sneak attacks. Same thing with this guy, right? He had made a career out of it. Brendan and James very much cut from the same cloth here. Same black cloth, that is. Now, in 1324, Robert had a son, his own son, a David. So that makes this Robert Stuart now second in line to the throne. So he's pushed down a spot, right? In the 1320s in general, King Edward II, again, not nearly as effective as his father, gave power to the Despenser family. Yeah, they dispensed power to the Despensers. That's right. They were Marcher Lords. You know, Marcher Lords, a familiar term. In Westeros, the marches are, well, it depends. There's a couple different marches. The Dornish marches in the Stormlands. There's Dornish marches also in the Reach. Basically just the borders. The marchers in England are the borders of Wales. So Wales was also, for a very long time, you know, a separate country that was ruled as a vassalship, but eventually, you know, Edward Longshanks conquered them and they became fully part of England at that point. So the Despensers were really bad. They were awful. They were rapacious. They stole lots of land. One of their tactics was to take land from widows who were unable to fight the claims, or they didn't have enough help to stop this from happening. This is the kind of thing that the widow's law introduced by Alisane was designed to combat against, this sort of thing. In 1326, the old alliance was renewed. In 1327, Edward II was deposed and killed by his own wife and her lover, Roger Mortimer. Such a thing would never have happened to the Longshanks, even though in the movie they portrayed the same woman as sleeping with William Wallace, the same Isabella. Didn't happen. She was like 12 in that moment in real life, so no, she was not sleeping with William Wallace. So Edward II dies. Edward III becomes king. Thankfully, it's just another Edward. Actually, is that good or is that bad? I don't know. This Edward would rule for 50 years, so he's going to be in the picture for a while, and of course he's going to make war on Scotland again. In fact, Isabella and Roger thought, hey, what better way to legitimize our rule than by attacking Scotland? Everybody, all the English will love us if we win victories over the Scots. Yeah, anyway. Now, Edward III, we don't need to talk about him very much, but I do want to draw a connection to our Wars of the Roses episode. Because Edward III's children include Edward the Black Prince and John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt is the guy that both York and Lancaster houses come from. So that's pretty big. Little connection to our previous episode. Now, Walter Stuart died, even though he was young. So his son with Marjorie Bruce, that young Robert Stuart, becomes the 7th High Steward, even younger than his father was, who became High Steward at 13. He's 11. And of course, he also has Sir James Stuart as his guardian, the Black James. Again, or the Black James, the Black Douglas. Black James, that works. So Edward III is a formidable king eventually, but at this point he's a teenager, he's inexperienced, and he's nominally in charge of his army when they invade Scotland, but not really. They say he's in charge, but really it's his advisors. The Black Douglas just completely run circles around them. Edward's invading army is there. They go here, they go there. The Black Douglas ambushes them, leads them away from where they can get supplies, burns the supplies, burns the countryside. They're all at wit's end. Eventually, he leads a night assault against them when he seems to have a strong position. They're not expecting it. They're like, well, if you're sitting up there, we're going to hold out. We can't attack you, but you're going to run out of food. He says, okay, yes, I am running out of food, but I can attack you at night because I'm the Black Douglas. So they attack, and they almost actually capture Edward III. They get as far as his tent and cut some of the poles out. His own pastor, his personal pastor, the king's pastor, dies trying to defend him. So good pastor, I guess. If your pastor's going to take one for you, I guess they had chose well with that guy, but he's dead now. Well, all these guys are dead now, but he was dead then. This is followed by Robert counter-invading. Robert the Bruce leads an invasion into England. It's very successful because of the embarrassing loss they just suffered. And finally, in the year 1328 or 1327, the English throne finally recognizes that Robert the Bruce is king of Scotland. They're like, fine, you win, you proved it. All right, it took 20-some years, but okay. Now, this included marrying that new son, David, to Edward III's sister, Joan, a.k.a. Joan of the Tower. This is the daughter of Isabella, who was the she-wolf of France. Now, I said married, and I meant married, not betrothed, even though David was 4 and Joan was 7. Yes, married and not betrothed. Yes. So, peace at last, 1328. It only lasted 4 years. But before that, we get our Braveheart and Bittersteel example. Robert died in 1329, so you might have thought peace would last even less time because their powerful king dies. He was only 55. We don't know why he died. It's not clear. Anyway, his dying wish was very Bittersteelish. He wanted his heart to go to the Holy Land, either to be buried there or to be carried while people holding his body, his heart, were fighting against God's foes. One or the other. So who decides to do this for him? None other than the Black Douglas. He takes Robert's heart, removes it from the corpse. Well, not personally. That was done by other people. He puts it in a silver casket, a small silver casket around his neck. Hey, I'm wearing gray and silver, sort of, and here's the heart. Yeah, I have Robert the Bruce's heart right here. No, this is Stannis.
That silver casket was originally intended for finger bones.
Nice. Yeah, that's right. So he took Robert's heart with him on crusade, just like Bittersteel's skull was carried in front by the Golden Company when they returned to Westeros. What's extra wild here is that even though the Black Douglas was the most bitter foe of Edward III, of course they were cousins because all these folks are related, right? Edward III wrote the Black Douglas a letter of recommendation. He's like, yeah, take this guy on crusade. On the surface, that's a little weird because they were bitter enemies. On the other hand, it's like, well, you're going to go on crusade
down there. You're not coming after me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Go to the Holy Land by all means. Go, but way the hell over there. It's so far away. So the Black Douglas goes on crusade. He wants to go on crusade with the English or the French or the Scots, but they couldn't get their act together. So he goes to Castile and goes on crusade with King Alfonso XI, a.k.a. Alfonso the Avenger, a.k.a. Alfonso XI. Because he had, even though he was Alfonso XI, he had 11 children, only one of whom was legit. Now, this is where we give a little shout out to Sevilla. Ashea and I were just in Spain. We went to buildings that King Alfonso XI and other Alfonsos lived in and or built and or restored, and it was great. So we're going to have lots of pictures in a future episode. And maybe we'll talk a little more about Alfonso XI and Alfonso XIII, Ashea's favorite, the Porn King. That's right.
Yeah,
Alfonso
what
XIII.
a man. What a guy. I support his proclivities.
Unfortunately for the Black Douglas, it didn't go so well with King Alfonso. He and his men at one point were cut off from their allies, and he bravely stood his ground, and they were overrun by the Muslims, I suppose. The body was recovered and went back to England along with Robert's heart. Robert's heart was recovered. And to this day, Robert's heart rests in Melrose Abbey. Probably. Maybe there's some doubt, but not much. Now, all Scottish monarchs, period, since Robert the Bruce, are related to Robert the Bruce. All British monarchs since 1603 are also related to Robert the Bruce. Nina reminds us that Kit Harington is in that club. Kit Harington was descended from Charles II's son, the Duke of Lennox, and Rose Leslie is also descended from Charles II through a different branch of Scottish aristocracy. So yeah, Kit and Rose, incest! Oh my gosh, no, it's extremely far apart. They're not even like trackable cousins, just like 20th cousins or something like that. Anyway. Ashea and I's trip to Spain was amazing, but of course, when you travel and fly long distances and drive long distances, you can get a little out of sorts with your sleep schedule, and your jet lag can be a factor. You can kind of easily get sick when you're overseas. Both Ashea and I have been sleeping a little funny once we came back, and by funny, I mean extra. Longer periods of time, recovering from all that. One of the tools that I find very useful for recovering from fatigue and any sort of situation where whether I'm sick or just tired our good friends Magic Mind. We've seen anecdotal evidence from comments, lots of them, that people have used Magic Mind to recover from long COVID, or short COVID too, I suppose. I haven't had long COVID, at least not that I know of, but I have noticed that Magic Mind is great for that. Now, I didn't drink Magic Mind when we were in Spain. I took a break because I didn't want to carry it around with me. Like carrying all these bottles around, even though they're tiny, while traveling, yeah, that's a bit much. So I'm very happy to be back to it, and I could immediately tell the difference. It was a little bit of a boost for me as I'm trying to get back to normal. So let's have a shot together, shall we? 20% off if you use the code VIPHOW20. That's VIPHOW20, magicmind.com. Get that off of your subscription, save some money, start concentrating and remembering better, waking up a little more, being restored. Let's do it. Good stuff. Also, we're back in the swing of things on Twitch. We're playing House Corbray right now. Good times, good times. So check us out. Twitch.tv, History of Westeros. And don't forget Magic Mind at magicmind.com/VIPHOW20. Big shout out to Minotaur on our Discord, one of our listeners, Scottish gentleman. And I say gentleman because his help was so valuable to this episode. He's from the town of Hoyk, which is spelled Haywick, which is a house in A Song of Ice and Fire. He wants me to mention as well Len Lonmouth, who, of course, that's a name from our Discord as well, and a reference to a character in A Song of Ice and Fire. He's the one who pointed out to Minotaur that House Haywick exists in A Song of Ice and Fire. Now, it's Hoyk. You say it like really fast. That's how you say Haywick in Scottish. I don't suppose the A Song of Ice and Fire version is pronounced that way. And House Haywick, the A Song of Ice and Fire version, are married into House Frey and Haywick's from the Salt Pans. So good job. That's very helpful. Minotaur gave me a ton of references and little nuggets to look into for this episode. A large portion of these were at least encouraged by him or suggested. I might not have found some of them without him. Some of them definitely wouldn't have. Here's one more anecdote from him. Scottish nicknames are great. As I said, he pulled this one from me. People from a place called Galashiels, probably said that wrong, are known as pale mercs. What's a pale merc? Well, it's a saying that references the fact that this was the last region of Scotland to get indoor toilets. So they used to sit on buckets, and that would leave a mark on your butt. So that's the pale mark, the mark from a bucket on your butt.
It's not like pale white. It's like a bucket. That
yes.
You're sitting on. Yes,
that kind of bucket. Yeah. He said, just thought you might find that amusing. You are correct. I did find that amusing because I do have the sense of humor of a 9-year-old. You will see more of that sense of humor later in this episode. Something I learned about this medieval period, I don't know how long this rule existed, is you can't get knighted until you're 21. We have kings operating at age 16, 17, 18, but you can't be knighted till you're 21. This is very much like in the U.S. where you can't drink till you're 21, but you can vote and go to the army when you're 18. Like, what? We can give you this responsibility that you die or help rule the country, but you can't have a drink until you're 21. Anyway, I ran into a lot of other funny names, not funny names, but similar names that I recognize from A Song of Ice and Fire while doing this. It's probably a ton more that I missed, but a couple that I wanted to mention was Harlaw. There's a Battle of Harlaw that we'll mention later. There's a place called Harlaw in northern Scotland, and there's a castle called Hermitage that has a dark reputation. That, of course, reminds me of High Hermitage, where Darkstar lives. So, dark reputation, Dark Star, High Hermitage, etc. That's, of course, a cadet branch of House Dane. Back to it with a portion called the Scottish Golden Company. This is the second Scottish War of Independence. The first one was won when Robert defeated Edward II finally, or defeated Edward III, I guess, because Edward II was dead right before that. Either way, he defeated England. But things came back around. So even though Isabella and Roger Mortimer, who overthrew Edward II, rebelled, one of the reasons they rebelled was against Edward II and overthrew him was because they weren't sure that her son Edward III would be allowed to rule. But then ironically, after making sure he could rule, they held on to power for themselves. So they didn't actually let him rule, they ruled on their own. But Edward III, again, competent, lots more like his grandfather than his father. He pushed his mother out, and had Roger executed. So she was able to keep her wealth and her status, but she was out of politics. So that was that. Now this is amazing. Remember when Tyrion is sneaking through the walls and he hears them talking about him and they're like, I think Tyrion's going to die like a coward. And he goes, no, he's going to die like a Lannister. And he's like, I like that guy. The one who thought I said I was going to die like a man. Well, of course, Tyrion didn't die at all. But anyway, so Lancastrian supporters actually helped here. They helped Edward III. And a guy named William Montague led about 20 good men through a secret tunnel, think Red Keep tunnels. We're told that an active council session was going on, and the topic of the council session at that moment was what to do about William Montague, the very man who was sneaking through tunnels into their room at that very moment. He jumped in and got rid of them, and Edward III was able to assume the throne as was his right. And in 1332, a little while after that, Edward allied with a group of Scottish exiles called the Disinherited. Yes, the Disinherited. They were Scottish nobles who lost lands during these previous conflicts. They wanted their lands back. Very much like the Golden Company exiles, where they're like, hey, we're famous families. We have names of prominence, but we lost our lands. We want them back. Give our lands back. So this is very similar to that. And that's what happens when you fight on the losing side. But in their case, these are nobles who get second and third chances and all that. But to be the Golden Company, to complete a Golden Company parallel, you need a pretender at the head of their ranks, right? A king, a pretender to the throne, someone like a son of Rhaegar or someone purporting to be the son of Rhaegar. Exactly what they got here. Not a guy named Rhaegar, not a son of Rhaegar. His name wasn't Aegon. But remember we said John Balliol, empty coat, was out of the picture, but his son was not? Here comes the son, little darling. I also told you that the Scots weren't done dealing with Edwards. So we got Edward III here. So that's one Edward. Now, what do you suppose John Balliol's son was called? Yes, indeed, Edward. Edward.
You had a 20% chance of guessing that because there are only 5 names.
There are only 5 names. That's right. Edward Balliol had been betrothed to none other than Isabella, daughter of Marguerite d'Anjou, the very Cersei parallel that we talked about, who married into House Lancaster. And of course, she had a son, Edward, as well, who was killed. But this marriage never actually happened. This was a betrothal. That betrothal was broken because Edward ultimately wasn't successful. But before that, he was involved in a plot to depose Robert the Bruce. That also didn't succeed. When Robert the Bruce's son David ascended as David II, he was only 6. So this is when Edward Balliol took his shot. He's like, okay, we got a 6-year-old on the throne. We've got secret support from Edward III. Not that secret because, hey, we know about it now, several hundred years later. It's like the most obvious Scooby-Doo reveal ever. Like, who's under this mask? Who's helping support this invasion of Scotland? An Englishman named Edward? I can't believe it. Right? And of course, like a year later, he's just openly supporting him anyway. There was no need for all this secrecy in the first place. Yeah. And just as obviously, when there's a foreign power supporting Scotland, especially against England, it's France. So the old alliance, but also because it's pragmatic for France, constant enemy of England, to have someone to attack England from another front or to draw English resources away from them. So Edward Balliol landed in Fife, the same place where Alexander III rode off that cliff to his death, and the same place ruled by that former Duncan III who was murdered by his own kin on his way to execute the business of the regency. That little baby who inherited Duncan IV was an adult now, and he also brought Robert the Bruce's bastard, called Robert Bruce. Like, come on. This guy helps the Earl of Fife fight Edward Balliol, but
you can't complain about that too much. That's a 6th name. We've got Bruce now. So.
That's right. So this battle's called Duplin Moor, not Dublin Moor, Duplin Moor, and Edward wins. Edward Balliol wins this battle, and Robert Bruce is killed. Balliol then claims the throne, but it's kind of like, Aegon claiming Sunspear or Daeron claiming Sunspear. Like, the rest of the country doesn't really recognize this. They're like, yeah, you took the throne, but we don't have to follow you. It's just a seat, bro. So he loses control of the country within the same year. Then, with Edward III openly helping him, he regains it in 1333. Then he loses it in 1334. Then he gets it back in 1335. Then he loses it again in 1336. I'm not joking. It really went like that. Just what the hell? So, no, we don't have to go through the detail of all that. It's just the back and forth is the story there. And during all that back and forth, Edward III pledges the hand of his sister, Joan of the Tower, to Edward Balliol. But, Aziz, didn't you just tell us that Joan of the Tower, despite being so young, was married to David? Not betrothed, you said. You said married. Yes. Edward fully intended to just undo that marriage. I don't exactly know how, but you can guess that lack of consummation was part of it. I mean, they were, 8 years old or whatever, so they definitely hadn't consummated it. But this didn't happen. Now,
it's ironic, of all the things that were options that did happen, undoing a marriage was not really one. Like, that's the thing that, like, of all the different things that might have killing a kid or taking a castle, whatever, like, when I read that they were going to undo this marriage, like, well, that's not going to happen. Like,
be easier to kill him, right?
No way that's going to happen.
Yeah, you're right. It didn't. Yeah. So David was actually captured at one point during this back and forth too. So they captured the King of Scotland. You would think that's the end. Nope, it wasn't. Again, the killing of nobles and royals was pretty rare. We saw that in Norway. We saw this in other examples. And again, this is me setting up why the Black Dinner was shocking, because this sort of thing was actually unusual. And I repeat it because it's probably hard to get in that mindset of actually these late medieval folks. Sure, they were brutal and ruthless, but less so than people who came before them. They were a lot less willing to kill. This was the burgeoning influence of the church, I think, in a lot of ways. A church that was never so powerful in Westeros. So I think that's part of why Westeros never got to that point, because that culture never developed in Westeros. Maybe it will someday, but certainly hasn't yet. So David's new guardian, while captured, is none other than Sir Archibald Douglas, who is half-brother to Black Douglas. This Archibald Douglas is the guy who the Red Douglases will descend from. So keep an eye on him. Even though there's going to be a lot of Archibalds, it's going to be hard to keep track of all the Archibalds. Now, Archibald was killed that same year, so you don't have to keep track of this particular Archibald anymore. The same city, Berwick on Tweed, where Edward I massacred citizens, the same one where William the Bold was captured, the father of both of the Black and the Red Douglases, Archibald Douglas was killed leading the defense of that same place in 1333. So, remember that the Black Douglas died on Crusade, and now Archibald Douglas has died. They have a middle brother called Hugh. Now, his nickname was Hugh the Dull. The real reason Hugh is called the Dull, as I said, was because he's a priest. But my theory is Hugh was pushed out of the lordship, which is what happens next, because his name was Hugh. If you look at the list of the earls and lords of Douglas, they're all William, James, or Archibald. There's only 3 names among all the Lord Douglas of the Black Line and the Earl Douglases and the Lord Douglases before that. Only 3 names, except for Hugh is a 4th name, and he's the only one that didn't get to keep the title. So I think that's the real reason.
You chose the wrong name, Hugh. What were you thinking?
That's right. So in 1337, Hugh the Dull had given their cousin, another William Douglas, the Knight of Liddesdale, a.k.a. the Flower of Chivalry, which is what I'm going to call him from now on because there's too many William Douglases. He's the commander of the family now. He doesn't have the title, but he sort of muscles his way into it over Hugh the Dull. And Hugh the Dull says, sure, I'm a priest. Go ahead. I don't want to do military commands anyway. We're not sure. This Flower of Chivalry guy, it's an ironic nickname, to be clear. It's like a skinny guy named, Kevin the Fat or something like that. And there is going to be a James the Fat later in the story. This guy is also, besides the Flower of Chivalry, was called Flail of the English and Wall of the Scots. Like, he's a wall. But we'll call him the Flower of Chivalry. He continued the Douglas guerrilla tactics. Very good at it. As good as the Black Douglas, most likely. And It's where he got his nickname, the Flower of Chivalry, by being a guerrilla war leader. Very, like I said, very ironic. It was he who commanded half of the forces in the 1335 defeat of Edward Balliol during all that back and forth. So he was really, really good commander. But not a good man. He was like an evil Beric Dondarrion, we'll see. Kind of in the early days, he was good. The Scots respected him, but over time, maybe power went to his head. I don't know. His men lived in a network of forests and caves. Ineffective poverty, ambushing and raiding. It's very much like the Brotherhood without banners. And him being their leader, Beric Dondarrion, the Flower of Chivalry in this case. But again, not nearly as noble as Beric. And definitely didn't die multiple times. I don't know about flaming swords either. Maybe they had flaming swords. They definitely used fire, though. A lot of burning happened. All right, let's focus on the Flower of Chivalry here for a minute. In 1341, he recaptured Edinburgh Castle after it had been lost during all that back and forth in 1335. Now, of course, this castle changed hands a lot of times. And I kid you not, the Flower of Chivalry did this in a Victorian Greyjoy at Slaver's Bay type method, aka the Trojan horse method. The Edinburgh Castle needed lots of supplies to feed the garrison, to get arrows and flint for their swords and all the stuff. They needed lots of stuff. One day, the Flower of Chivalry and his men hid in hay wagons and were brought inside the castle. They jumped out of the hay wagons, held the gate open while more Douglas men rushed inside and took the castle. Amazing. In early 1342, he was made an earl, but then he had to give that up to Robert Stuart, which was the Robert Stuart, son of Marjorie Bruce and Walter Stuart, who is now second in line for the throne behind King David. So there's a pattern developing here. We have the Flower of Chivalry just keeps kind of getting land, maybe muscling his way into it and then losing it because it really shouldn't have been his in the first place. He also held title over Roxburgh Castle, another important castle that changed hands a bunch of times during all these conflicts. But he wasn't able to get it back. He tried several times and failed. And he was annoyed by this because, well, he held the title. He wanted it back. Now, this is the same place Robert the Bruce's daughter Mary was hanged. Not hanged, not to death, but hanged in a cage outside to embarrass her. This is, bad. So in 1313 or 1314, on the night of Shrovetide, which is a religious holiday, again, they're attacking on a religious holiday, following in the footsteps of the Black Douglas. And indeed, this was, since we're talking about before the Black Douglas's death, this is 1313. Remember, now we're in roughly the year 1340. The Black Douglas had led a night attack on this Roxburgh Castle with 60 men dressed in black cloaks who were mistaken for sheep, or rather cattle climbing the walls. They were cattle climbing the walls. Like, those cattle are climbing the walls. That seems unusual. They wore all black and used like with long spears to raise like a rope ladder up over the battlements, and they climbed over and they took the castle. Then they destroyed the fortifications because they were pretty sure they'd lose the castle again. Which they did. And now that brings us back to here, where he's unable to recapture it because the English had rebuilt those defenses. Now, in 1342, a certain Sir Alexander Ramsay, spelled like Ramsay Bolton, but not much like Ramsay, although what's done to him is very like Ramsay, he recaptures it in another night assault. And he's rewarded by King David, which made the Flower of Chivalry mad, because he wanted to be the one to take that castle back, and he'd already had a rivalry with this Sir Alexander Ramsay. So later that year, 1342, Flower of Chivalry just rides with some men to Hoyk, seizes Alexander Ramsay, ties him to a mule, and takes him to that castle hermitage that I mentioned earlier, and starves him to death. Yikes. Hugh the Dull also died in 1342, and the Flower of Chivalry became not just Lord of Douglas, but tried to rule and tried to hang on to power, and this didn't go so well. Let's back up just a little bit. Go ahead.
That ties into a mule part I find so odd. I've been trying to figure out what...
Just to embarrass him, or I don't know.
Keep him from running away. Is it dangerous? Maybe being tied the mule might kick you, or the smell of the mule poop is around all the time. I don't know. I was thinking about the heart hanging around your neck too. It's got to smell. What's the reality of that? How much does it smack you in the chin when you're riding your horse. Like sometimes I just try to think about the day-to-day reality of some of this stuff. It's so odd to me.
So there was an offer in 1336 made by Philip the Fortunate, the new king of France. This is Philip VI. The offer is, okay, Edward Balliol gets to become king. David, you get to become his heir. But you have to give up that Joan of the Tower to Edward. They say no. He's like, no, I'm not doing that. No deal. No, definitely no deal. One of the reasons this deal was rejected was because of Robert Stuart, who was in charge of things. He was the steward, even though he was also second in line to the throne. He wasn't about to accept any deal that pushed him out of the line, further down the line of succession either. So this was not only unpalatable to David, but to him. So there's a lot of opposition to this. The next year, the 100 Years' War begins. Scotland is not deeply embroiled in it, but Scottish people are. Like, a lot of nobles fight over there, either for the French or for other reasons, but usually just as allies to the French, mostly to fight against England. Now, by 1338, Edward Balliol is still trying to win, but he's just losing popularity, and he's being seen as more and more English because more and more of his support is English and not Scottish. And he's considered a usurper by this point. So in 1341, the year before this incident with the starvation of Alexander Ramsay, David was 17 and takes over the government, even though he's younger than you can be a knight. And but things were tense. There's lots of feuds. Scotland was in a tense place. And this is an increasing problem as Scotland becomes a more powerful kingdom. More and more nobles getting more power. They have more to lose, more to fight over. It took David a good 4 years to kind of calm things down. And all the while, the war is still happening against England. But the war is also happening in France during the 100 Years' War. So England's divided. Their attention is. In 1346, Edward III is still well embroiled in France and doing well. So France needs some help. They're like, David, you're old enough now. Why don't you invade? Go invade England to draw some attention back over there. He does it. We're told he happily did so. He brings a lot of men, like 12,000 men. He brings 3 armies. One he leads himself. One is led by the flower of chivalry, and one is led by Robert Stuart. Okay? So he allows his men to rampage through Durham. They're kind of pillaging and looting the countryside. And then he's surprised by an English army. They didn't expect resistance so fast, but the English mobilized quickly. And the 3 portions of the army all unite to fight the Battle of Neville's Cross, which was a disastrous loss for Scotland. Robert Stuart and his men flee. And King David II is hit twice in the face by arrows. He lives, though, and is such a badass that when they come to seize him, he breaks the teeth of one of the guys who grabs him with his mailed fist. And the flower of chivalry was captured as well. Now, many of the nobles caught in this battle are ransomed because Edward III constantly needs money for this war in France. But he doesn't release those 2. They're too important. Now, the flower of chivalry was such an established leader at this point, even though he was operating above his titles. He actually ordered a hit from prison like some kind of mafia boss. Some knight killed his brother while he was in prison, and he ordered that knight killed, and it happened while he's in prison in England. So that's pretty wild. This next section is called The King in Chains. And of course, it refers to David II. So Edward Balliol is still trying to win and still failing here many years later. And eventually, things are going to come to a head shortly here. But in the meantime, Robert Stuart, who escaped, he was the one leader who escaped that disaster, was calling the shots. He's the 7th High Steward. He's grandson of Robert the Bruce. He has a lot of political clout, and he's basically ruling in David's name.
And now, he's just a teenager.
Yeah. Robert's very young too. Yeah. He's a little older than David. No, I think he's not a teenager anymore, but he's a young 20s at this point, I think. Okay. Anyway, another offer comes by. That same John of Gaunt, who Lancaster and York descend from, they were like, hey, what if you make John of Gaunt your heir, David? And he's like, no. Again, no. Robert Stuart says, again, I'm David's heir, so no, I'm not. We're not going with that. So again, that was pushed aside. In 1348, things came to a head for the flower of chivalry. Not only had he seemingly forced his uncle to give that lordship to him, so that wasn't exactly legal, he had held Archibald's heir, the true lord of those lands, of the Douglas lands. He held him as his ward. It was like one of the situations where the ward is the legal owner of the titles, but the powerful guy in charge kind of keeps the stuff for himself. The problem is, this William guy who's his ward, remember, they're both Williams. The Flower of Chivalry's name is William Douglas also. So this is Archibald's heir, William Douglas. He had been educated in France. He was kept over there and was getting a good education, but finally he's old enough to come home. So he immediately comes back and follows in the footsteps of all the other Douglases of this era who were war leaders, guerrilla style, and immediately goes to war with the English who were squatting on his lands. So he wins over a lot of those men that had fought for the Flower of Chivalry become his men. All the while, the Flower of Chivalry is imprisoned at the Tower of London. 3 years later, Edward III says, all right, the time has come. I'm going to go ahead and ransom King David and the Flower of Chivalry because I really need more money. The ransom is 40,000 pounds, just an absurd amount of money in this era. He releases them to go collect them. It's like, okay, I'm going to let you guys go collect the money. Give me the money. And again, you see the kind of odd culture that is happening here, the beliefs that they adhere to. They failed to collect the money and just report back for imprisonment. They didn't just try to run off. You're not going to catch us. We're out of your hands now. They just go back to prison. But
like the idea that they expected them to leave, get the money, and come back, and then be let go again, like on both sides, it's so crazy to me. Like, say they had got the money. I'm just trying to imagine how do they physically deliver it? How much like that's do it? Like how do they not get robbed by bandits on the way? There's so much about that. It just blows my mind. Like,
right? It is really hard to believe, but that's what happened. So since it didn't work, Edward tries a different tactic. He's like, all right, Flower of Chivalry, you're a chivalrous guy, ironically. What if I give you lands and title in exchange for bringing your men over to my side? And I'm also going to keep some of your people as hostages, just in case you don't go with this plan, in case you try to double cross me.
Come back with 40,000 pounds.
Yeah. So in other words, and the Flower of Chivalry agrees to this. This is agreeing to treason. This is a treasonous deal. So, but he thought it was his play. He still did it. And this is what I'm saying. Like, he's an evil Beric Dondarrion because he was the good guy. He was leading his men. But then he kind of turns English, sort of. And he had been in prison for 11 years. Let's keep that in mind. Much had changed, though. Remember, what did I say? His men had turned to this other William Douglas, the one that was ward of his for a while. So when he gets back to Scotland, he's trying to bring these men over to Edward. They're already following this new other William Douglas, the actual true Lord of the Douglas lands. So a very odd event happens 2 years later. Edward Balliol, still squatting in Scottish lands, hasn't exited the picture yet. He's having no success whatsoever, but he's still in the picture so many years later. He was raided by the new Lord William here, who was trying to get Balliol to leave. He's like, I'm going to attack your forces and get you to leave. He's squatting in his territory. And on his way back from this raid, he encounters the Flower of Chivalry, who is hunting. Earl William is very resentful over, well, he's not Earl yet. He's about to become Earl because it becomes an earldom in 5 years. I'm calling him Earl William to distinguish him from the Flower of Chivalry William. He's resentful over lots of the things the Flower had done. Being a traitor, trying to steal his men, keeping him as a ward. We're not sure exactly, but he kills him. William Douglas kills William Douglas. Straight up, right? So Lord William kills the Flower of Chivalry. That's wild. So that happened. Then 2 years later, more scorched earth tactics, more ambushes. Edward III is driven back to his country and a new truce is signed. Scotland immediately breaks the truce with help from France. England gets mad, reinvades again the following year. Edward Balliol finally gives up. Even though he's still on the English side and England is doing well this time, he's like, all right, I'm done. He surrenders his claim to Edward III in exchange for money. Like, Can you do that? You can sell your claim? it declined in value, but he got good money for it.
I wish they had all bought and sold their claims instead of going to war and killing each other over their claims, honestly.
So Edward Balliol ends up like his father, John. Remember, John just goes and retires on his lands, lives out his days in obscurity. Edward does the same. He gets his second, third, fourth, I don't know how many chances he got. Just the ultimate rich guy's exit from the story. Like, he fails all these times, and he still gets to go live on his rich lands and just dies in obscurity. This time, though, no children. So it's actually done. The Balliols are actually done this time. So Edward III may have been like, yeah, I'm going to make myself King of Scotland. Screw all this other business. Screw vassals. Screw overlordships. Direct control is what we're after. But the weather messed up this campaign and some other things, but especially the weather and the scorched earth and all that other stuff. So he had to go back again. In 1357, the war ended, though. Edward's had enough, in part because of the 100 Years' War, had a huge battle, the Battle of Poitiers, I think it was, where the French suffered a humongous, humiliating defeat. Their king was captured in battle, and William Douglas was there. He had been knighted by King John II. He had barely escaped, as he couldn't bear to be captured by the English. But his first cousin, Archibald the Grim, was captured. Archibald the Grim. He's going to be important, too. So finally, they agreed on an actual ransom for David. Remember, before it had been 40K. They couldn't collect the money. So what do you do when you can't collect 40K? You increase the ransom to 100K. Like, you can't get me 40K? You have to get me 100K. They actually only paid about 20K of it. So, you know. Now, Joan of the Tower, even though David refused to give her up, he wasn't like, I'm not going to give away my wife. She didn't want to be with him because during his 11 years in prison, he had lots of conjugal visits and took a lover. But he had no children. So that's interesting. He didn't have any with her or his lovers. So he was maybe sterile, maybe like an Aegon the Conqueror situation. But a king without an heir is an interesting thing and a dangerous thing. Who was his heir, though? Robert Stuart, grandson of Robert the Bruce through his daughter Marjorie and the son of Walter Stuart, this guy who's still kind of running England, meaning Robert Stuart. So Scotland had fought off England after driving out the Norse. And this really reminds us of Dorne. Isn't this like Dornish more than anything? They just won't give up. They burn their own stuff. The local population often helps, and they just won't.
Tactics.
Yeah, very Dornish. Really, I think a lot of Scottish people would identify with Dorne. Maybe not today, maybe, but certainly in this era. There's a new feature on Patreon. We've had friends do this in the past, but now it's an official thing. You can gift a membership. You can buy a membership for someone else. You can give History of Westeros to your friends and family, buy subscriptions as gifts, give them access to our bonus content, give them shout outs, give them titles, give them all that fun stuff this Christmas season. It's the giving thing to do. It's great, right? But seriously, folks, episodes like this, a lot of y'all love them. I love them. But frankly, they're not super popular. This is not the kind of episodes we want to make if we want to get tens and tens of thousands of downloads and views. This is not popular content.
Thankfully, we want to cater to y'all, most of all, more than we want to appeal to popularity. We want
and the Scottish.
Exactly.
But no, I think this is the type of thing that makes Patreon great, is the fact that we can make the content that the most passionate of our fans want us to make, not the majority.
That is very well said and very accurate, because yes, it is more fun for us, and so we're thankful for that, but we wouldn't be able to do it without y'all, because without y'all, we would have to make more episodes about Starks and Targaryens and very rarely stray into these obscure topics, especially for deep dives this long, right? We just wouldn't be able to do it. So thank you very much. Sincerely, we really appreciate it, and we hope that support continues, because if it does, we'll continue doing stuff like this. Let's now move into the final phase of the episode, Scotland's Game of Thrones. Now is when we turn from outside wars to internal wars, for the most part, because Stuart and Douglas, after their long rise to prominence, fighting in all these wars of independence, all these wars against England, and before that against Norway, As they gain power through these conflicts, they start to fight each other more and more. Such is the way of power. You can see the elements in place already at the start of this phase of the episode. You have an ancient realm, an old kingdom with new power, and pride over what they've overcome, what they've beaten. That would give you a sense of pride. We beat the English many times. That's hard to do, and they're the smaller country. It is something to be proud of. But there's so many rivalries and blood feuds within Scotland that date back to who knows when, prior to their trouble with the English, before the English even existed, really. And that's where we get a nice Blackwood-Bracken parallel, because by now Stuart and Douglas have intermarried many times. Douglas is intermarried. Douglas is going to fight itself. Stuart's going to fight Douglas, just like Bracken and Blackwood fight each other. At this time, also, the king is the son of a famous hero king and has no children or brothers. Well, that nothing could go wrong, right? Of course, the succession will be smooth, right? Yeah. He didn't even have nephews from the male line because that Edward Bruce character died in England without Stuart reinforcements. He had no kids either. And worse, King David hated Robert Stuart, his heir, the seventh High Steward of Scotland. Why? I don't know, but there's a lot of reasons to guess. One is because because Robert escaped the same battle where David and the Flower of Chivalry were captured. Maybe Robert was cowardly in escaping that. Maybe he should have fought harder to save David. He's also the one that forced David to resume captivity because he wouldn't agree to the deal, pushing himself farther down in the line of succession. Maybe he was jealous, David was, that he had 0 children and Robert had 9, and then 13, and then 25. Yes, Robert Stuart, 7th High Steward of Scotland, had 25 children, and David had 0.
How many different wives was that with?
Only 2, but he had a lot of illegitimate children. Yeah, so he had 9 with his first wife, 4 with the second, and then 12 illegitimate children.
Blowing my mind, jeez.
I know, right? What the F? Now, David tried many times to disinherit Robert Stuart, but just couldn't do it. The most obvious way he tried to disinherit Robert Stuart was by having kids, but as we already said, that failed. Now, in 1358, it went from the lordship of Douglas to the earldom of Douglas. So they're earls from now on. In 1960, the Earl of Angus murdered David's lover, Catherine Mortimer. We don't know how Catherine Mortimer was related to Roger Mortimer, the lover of Isabella, the one who overthrew Edward II. But the Earl of Angus is going to very soon become the title of the Red Douglases. Not quite yet. In 1363, Robert rebelled with the support of the Douglases against David, but they came to terms. Apparently, David threatened to remove him from the line of succession. It's like, well, didn't you see that coming, Robert? You're the second in line. You're next in line to the throne. You go to war against the guy who's ahead of you, and he threatens you that you won't be king. Wait, aren't you rebelling against him? Can't you just force him? No, I don't know. It didn't work. Whatever happened, they said stop and went back to normal. But then the very next year, William supported the removal of Robert Stuart from the succession in exchange for the removal of that huge debt and the return of the Douglas lands in England. But it meant giving the Scottish throne to a certain Prince Lionel, a different son of King Edward III, even though they put a clause in that contract to say that, yes, after Lionel, the throne will go back to Scotland. The plan failed. They're like, I don't trust you. We can't trust you to give the throne back. So a bunch of back and forth again that kind of resulted in nothing. In 1371, David was only 46, but he died. It doesn't seem to be foul play, but it was definitely and it seems to have been a surprise because, he was kind of young. Robert ascends the throne as Robert II. It finally happened. The Stuarts had become kings. And the Douglases were, if not even more powerful than the Stuarts, close enough. So the Stuarts and the Douglases have really arrived at this point. Now, Robert starts making music. They like a Blood Raven type of thing or a Tywin Lannister kind of thing with the Reigns of Castamere, where they create music and ballads to glorify their reign. They connect themselves to the Bruces because, well, Bruce was his grandfather, but he has the name Stuart. So they got to make that clear to everybody else. They glorify good Sir James, a.k.a. the Black Douglas, and Walter the Stuart, who was the father of Robert Stuart, right? There were still problems, of course, but it was pretty good overall, this early period of Robert's rule, because there wasn't a lot of war, and Robert was a decent administrator, or maybe even a good administrator. The wool trade, which is still to this day a big deal in Scotland, really took off, and the ransom payments ended. So Scotland was way better off financially, and they started to recover and rebuild, and a lot of the scorched earth damage was undone. There were still raids, lots of fights on the border, but it was mostly confined to that, except for one case where the same John of Gaunt, that same guy that Lancaster and York descend from, he raided Scotland and got as far as Edinburgh before going back. Now, the Red and Black Douglas. Let's get into that. This is when that really comes to a head, and the two halves of the family really distinctly split. It's not 100% clear in reality when the split was official or when people started calling them the Red and Black Douglases. It doesn't really matter for our purposes, but it certainly happened. William, still in charge, Lord William, 1st Earl of Douglas, married Isabel, one of Robert Stuart's daughters, showing the growing closeness of the two families. One of those 25 children, but this is one of the legitimate children. Now, to be fair, legitimate and illegitimate in this time didn't mean as much as it does in Westeros. Bastards in this era, in medieval England, Scotland, France, they weren't shunned. They weren't looked down on nearly as much. They often got titles. They often got lordships, earldoms, what have you. So still they were lower, but they weren't like, oh, bastards are only conceived of lust and envy. Like, it wasn't really like that. So keep that in mind, that the illegitimate children aren't looked down on nearly as much as they are in Westeros. That's an important distinction. Now, we get a little romance on the side. Around 1380, same William Douglas begins an affair with Margaret Stuart, who was a widow by this time, but also his brother-in-law, because Margaret's deceased husband was William's wife's brother. Yeah. So you have a William married and a Margaret married to his brother. William's brother dies, and then William also hooks up with Margaret. Yeah, anyway. And Douglas also had a Stuart grandmother, so there's just so much Stuart and Douglas mixed into here now. You can't even keep track anymore, and you don't have to. Just know Douglas and Stuart are just dominating everything now. They would have 2 children, George and, of course, Margaret. George is the one who inherits the lands from his mother, because Margaret actually inherited the lands, the Angus lands, possibly because of that incident where the Earl of Angus assassinated David's lover, Catherine Mortimer. He was maybe punished for that, and then the lands went to the Douglases. It's like, yeah, give the Douglases more power. That's a good solution. So George inherits the Angus lands from Margaret, and this is the Red Douglases. That's official now, or at least official enough for our purposes. So the Red Douglases are the Angus lands, whereas the Douglas lands become the Black Douglas lands, the bigger branch. Over time, the branches would start to grow closer in power because it becomes like a scale. It's like, well, we can't have the Black Douglases being too powerful. We need the Red Douglases to counterbalance them. So instead of you have the Tyrells to balance out the Lannisters or whatever. It's all just the Douglases. The Red Douglas balancing out the Black. It's just so much Douglas. You can't even understand. You can't even count it all. There's just so much Douglas. Now, William Douglas, 1st Earl again, finished his life sort of the way it began, making and repelling border raids. Very Dornish again. Just a life of raids back and forth. He dies in 1384. James, 2nd Earl of Douglas, takes over, and it's even more officially the Black Douglas lands at this point. Now we have the incident of Black Douglas versus Fireball. Fireball, y'all remember, that's the famous commander who died the day before the Red Grass Field, one of the men who was crucial in encouraging Daemon Blackfyre to rebel. His real-life parallel is Sir Henry Percy, a.k.a. Hotspur. Hotspur, Fireball, you see the connection. Hotspur was also a very rash, very aggressive commander like Fireball was. I think they both had red hair. Remember, his supposed son, the kid that is the hero in the Mystery Knight, doesn't have red hair, but claims to be descendant of him. That's House Ball, right?
Supposed son? I won't stand for this injustice.
He won his trial by combat. He can prove now. Anyway, James launches his earldom, because it's now an earldom, and he's just taken it over, by raiding the English. What better way to celebrate becoming the Earl of the Black Douglas lands by raiding the English? It's a very Scottish thing to do, raid the English, just like it's a very English thing to do, to raid Scotland.
To raid the Scottish. Yeah.
Exactly. And France shows up in Scotland. Like a big French delegation shows up in Scotland to negotiate a truce with the English. They have it in this sort of semi-neutral ground. There were a lot of extra Frenchmen there. Some of them weren't happy about the idea of a truce, so they're like, hey, these French knights, a gang of them, and I'm calling them a gang on purpose, they're like, they float the word to the Scots. They're like, we like fighting the English. You like fighting the English. Yeah, they're trying to negotiate a truce. But what if we gang up together and go into England and raid it? Well, wouldn't that be cool? You can help us, we'll help you. They're basically sellswords saying, hey, or just opportunists or adventurers, pick your term. So James is like, yeah, let's do that. James, second Earl of Douglas, is like, let's do it. He brings his buddy Sir David Lindsay. This is 1484. They attack Northumberland. Remember, this Northumberland is the territory that is York territory, or was York territory. And of course, it's also associated with Uhtred, son of Uhtred. And son of Uhtred, son of Uhtred, son of Uhtred. Yes, lots of Uhtreds. So the French and James and David, they raid Northumberland. It's very successful. They carry off loot and stuff. And meanwhile, the truce is successful despite all this. They still call a truce despite this raid. It's like, one raid isn't going to ruin the whole thing. It's still kind of weird they got away with it. Like, there was no penalty for any of this, apparently. The French knights are like, okay, hey, we got to go back to France, but we had such a great time. Let's do this again. So that's what happened. The next year the truce expires. It was a short-term truce. I said 1484. I meant to say 1384. My bad. So in 1385, the truce expired and the French knights came back. They're like, yeah, we said we'd come back for more partying. We're back. They again raid England. But this time, Richard II is in charge of England, and he had a bigger army. Richard's army chases the Scots-French army back into Scotland, and he ravages the countryside, and the Scots ravage the countryside to deny him supplies. So it backfired pretty badly, yeah, especially for the common folk. Meanwhile, Archibald the Grim, who, remember, had been captured in France, was free by this time, and he was counter-raiding still in England while England is raiding in Scotland. So we're back to all the raiding. This raiding includes a place in England called Cockermouth, which I only mentioned because of my aforementioned 9-year-old sense of humor. Yes,
I hardly know her mouth.
Yeah. In 1388, King Richard II of England was having troubles, and they took another shot, meaning the Scots, to avenge the raid of 1385 that they started. Like, we raided your territory, you raided us back. We want revenge. Wait, they were... never mind. So this is when Earl William, still second Earl of Douglas, faced Sir Henry, a.k.a. Hotspur, in an actual duel. They fought a one-on-one duel with lances, and Douglas wins. He beats Henry and captures his pennon, which is his flag. So yes, he captured his flag. Supposedly, he bragged. He's like, William says... or James rather says, William, I had it right the first time. William says, I'm going to display your flag on my tower so all of Scotland can see it. And Hotspur's like, you'll never leave Northumberland alive with my flag. Well, it's debatable whether this is, it depends on which, I'll elaborate here. Then came a battle that had two great names. The Battle of Otterburn, where no otters were actually burned, or the Battle of Chevy Chase, where
otters were burned.
Otters were burned. Chevy Chase was involved. No, it's the same battle. So Hotspur tries a surprise attack. It wasn't very effective, and this is where some of the argument that he was a rash commander came from, because maybe it wasn't the best idea. Archibald the Grim was one of the leaders of the Douglas contingents, and it was a defeat for the English. Hotspur was captured, but Earl William was killed. So it was another one of these kind of Pyrrhic victories. So he wins. So he doesn't actually get to carry that flag back. I think the flag actually did go back, but not with Earl William. So it was like he did lose the flag, but Earl William was killed. So yeah, the ransom for Hotspur was so big that this guy named Sir John Montgomery built a whole ass castle with it. It's called Paulnoon Castle, and it's still there. Now let's talk a little bit about Archibald the Grim, because what a cool name. And he's going to become the third Earl of Douglas. After the death of William, William had no heirs, so Archibald the Grim takes over. Now, this is a little bit of chicanery here, because there's no obvious heir, but Archibald's the most powerful Douglas, so he claims it. This is going to start a bit of a pattern that's going to lead to the Black Dinner of, the Douglas lands are so big and powerful, and occasionally there's going to be fights over who inherits them. And that's going to be pretty much the state of the affairs for the rest of this episode, which is not a whole. We have about 5 pages of our 31-page document left, so we're getting near the end. Now, Archibald actually escaped from prison in France. We said he was in prison, but I didn't tell you how he got out. He did it by pretending to be someone lesser. He and a buddy staged a prison fight. We've seen this in so many movies where two prisoners get into a fight and they use it as an excuse to do something. In this case, they used it as a way to make him look like he was a nobody. Like he was captured. He had this great armor, and they were like, wow, look at that armor. And they took it from him and sold it. But they kind of forgot who he was because he'd been in prison for a while. So he pretended to be kind of a nobody and was let out for 40 pounds. Remember, David was ransomed for 100,000 pounds?
Yeah.
40 pounds. That's it. 40 bucks. Well, not bucks, but that was worth a lot of money then, but it's still kind of like, that's tiny. So yeah, this could have been a huge amount of money for Edward the Black Prince, another guy with the nickname Black. This was Edward the Black Prince, son of Edward III, a very capable military leader. Anyway, he's not a big part of the story, but he's in this little spot. So Edward the Black Prince was deprived of a massive ransom by this conniving of Archibald, who became the third Earl of Douglas. Now, this, of course, is setting up, like I said, our main course, which is the Black Dinner, and that main course is a black bull's head. Yes, it is. Robert II dies in 1390, aged 74. So he actually lasted quite a long time. He lived to a ripe old age. That's older than a lot of these folks make it to. David only made it to 46. Robert Bruce only made it to 55. There's some evidence that his sons, Robert II, who was also, his family still had the stewardship and the kingship, so it was like a lot of power there. And some of his sons, there's some evidence they started to usurp some of his authority. Despite all this, he reigned for 19 years. It's pretty good. One of his sons was nicknamed the Wolf of Bednock. Pretty cool. The other thing about bastards that's relevant here is they all had the last name Stuart. All his 12 bastards were blank Stuart. So that's another interesting difference. They weren't like, I don't know, what would you call, if they had a Westeros, it would be like Heather or Hill or something like that? What's the Scottish last name? Moore? Locke?
It'd probably be William or James.
William, William James. Oh my God. No. A good thing Sean wasn't in charge of the names. So Robert was succeeded by his son, John Stuart. But John's like, I don't want to be John. John Balliol sucked. I don't want to be associated with him. So what am I going to change my name to? Robert. Even though he already had a brother named Robert. So there's Robert and another brother. It's like this haakon thing all over again. You got a king haakon, uncle haakon, son haakon. Yeah, and of course there's going to be another son, Robert, too. Now, Robert III wasn't healthy, though. He inherited, but just like his grandmother, Marjorie Bruce, he fell from a horse. He didn't die like she did, but he was permanently injured by it. And he was not a very good ruler either, not a strong ruler. So, by the combination of his infirmity and his bad politics, his authority was limited and somewhat shared with his son and heir, another David. Archibald the Grim was more powerful than the king. The Douglas more powerful than the king is and was a common thing. In fact, a guy named Archibald more powerful than the king. It happened a few times because Archibald is going to be succeeded by Archibald, who's going to be succeeded by Archibald. This is when things get very red and black Douglas, and the families really start to be defined as halves and start to fight against each other more and more. The Red Douglas power was increased by Robert III to counterbalance the Black Douglas power. He also married his daughter, Mary, to George Douglas, the guy who basically founded the Red Douglases, the ones who ruled the Angus lands rather than the Douglas lands. And another daughter to the descendant this guy was also a descendant of, or this girl was actually a descendant of the Flower of Chivalry as well. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Another daughter of the Flower of Chivalry was married to another James Douglas at this time, to shore it all up. This is another Red Douglas. So he died in 1400, the Archibald the Grim, that is, but was able to keep this strong power by passing it on to Archibald IV, fourth Earl, that is. Next, we talk about Robert the Kinslayer. That's my nickname for him, and you'll very quickly say why. Term kinslaying, I don't think they use that in Scotland. If they did, I never heard it. So it really explains things. This Prince David died in 1402, probably killed by this Robert the Kinslayer, his uncle Robert, the Robert who had his name taken by his older brother, who changed his name to Robert. So maybe he wasn't happy about his name being stolen. I don't know. The other brother, Robert, also died young. So David and his younger brother, Robert, were both died. And that made James the heir. Yeah, a James, right? James became James the First, but Robert the Kinslayer was his regent. So, and Robert III dies in 1406. So what does Robert the Kinslayer do? He's like, I'm just gonna keep ruling as the regent. This James doesn't matter. And indeed, James was raised in France for his safety. He was almost abducted by Earl Archibald IV. His men came for him, but he escaped. He instead was abducted by the English. He escaped captivity from his Scots allies, or erstwhile allies, or opponents, whatever, other Scots, to only be captured by the English and delivered by the king, or to the king, who was now Henry IV, son of that same John of Gaunt who keeps coming into the story. So again, these are the descendants, these are the Lancastrians and the Yorks eventually. Now, this was a really good captivity as far as captivities go. He was given a great education like a lot of royals are, even though he's in captivity. They brought him on campaign. Henry V took him on campaign. Henry V was a great military leader. He had a lot of success in France. But this is a problem. Because who are the English campaigning against in France when they're fighting against the French? The Scots. So the King of Scotland in captivity is being brought on campaign against his own people. So he learned a lot about military, but his reputation wasn't great because he was constantly on the side of the English as they fought against Scottish forces in France. Think Theon as a ward of Winterfell. The Greyjoys didn't trust him when he came back. Like, nah, you were raised as a wolf. You weren't raised in our culture. You were raised in theirs. You're not one of us. You have the name, but not the education, not the life. You're not one of us. Similar vibe here.
Not the culture.
Yeah, very much. You're more French or English than you are Scottish. Not French, English. So he had also been imprisoned alongside Murdoch Stuart, which was Robert the Kinslayer's son. So even though Robert the Kinslayer wanted to rule through James was imprisoned alongside Murdoch, who was Robert's son. Now, Robert the Kinslayer arranges the release of his son Murdoch by trading him for Hotspur's son, who had also been captured. Hotspur was dead by this time. This is 10 years later. But the Kinslayer just refused to negotiate at all for James I's release. He just didn't want James out of prison because he wanted to keep ruling. So Robert does that. Robert the Kinslayer continues to rule and claim more power and just bring more power to himself and gets it all going. At one point, he forces a claim on a place called Ross, which is a territory in Scotland, tries to give it to his second son, which ends in the Battle of Harlaw, which was nicknamed Red Harlaw because of how bloody it was. This was against a guy called Lord of the Isles, a very familiar name from A Song of Ice and Fire. The Lord of the Isles was a constant thorn in the side of many Scottish monarchs because their territory was so far north. A lot of it was those same islands that used to be ruled by the Norse. It was kind of hard to exert authority over them because they're just like hundreds of little, 900 Scottish isles. 900. So like, yeah, it's hard to like collect taxes from every individual. Not, people don't live on all of them, but still, it's hard to exert power over that. So in 1420, the Kinslayer just dies. He'd up and dies. Not of anything strange. He was 80. So it was his time, I guess. But Murdoch and his sons, the same Murdoch that was negotiated for release by Robert, was later found guilty of treason along with his sons, and they were executed. This line of the Stuarts was called the Albany Stuarts, and they were very powerful. And they were basically pushed aside now, and all that did was open up more power for the Douglases. So it's like you take power from the Stuarts, it goes back to the Douglases. It's like they can't seem to distribute power anywhere else but Stuart and Douglas. Even get rid of one Stuart, a Douglas takes it. Get rid of a Douglas, a different Douglas takes it. It just keeps happening. So now we have James and the Black Douglas, not to be confused with James and the Giant Peach. The fall of the Albany Stuarts did indeed make Archibald Douglas, 4th Earl, the most powerful man in Scotland. Even more powerful than he had been. So arguably this made the problem worse. But he actually shored this up by working towards James's release. He actually wanted James to get out, and he was helping do this when Robert the Kinslayer was still in charge because he wanted to be rewarded. He could see what was happening. He's like, this Robert Stuart is keeping our king in prison, but he didn't make an ideological issue out of it. He's like, opportunity. Yes, if I free the king, I can be second in command to get rewards, which means more lands and titles and all that. In 1424, James married Joan Beaufort. Yes, those Beauforts, the same ones that were all over the Wars of the Roses. And then he was released for ransom, of course, after 18 years in prison, or in sort of prison, just in captivity, house arrest, whatever you want to call it. He wasn't behind bars. This is the time of Henry VI, which was our Henry Baylor. But remember, Henry Baylor was a baby when he took the throne. So he didn't really take the throne. He was ruled by the nobles around him. And those nobles were like, it's time to do away with us having this Scottish king on our... We got too much going on. We also want that money. So he was finally let out. In 1424, when he's released, he immediately starts undermining Black Douglas estates through legalese. He starts looking up old charters and saying, hey, this sentence is wrong. It makes your whole claim invalid. So this is how he's undermining the Black Douglases. Doesn't go great, but it's pretty effective. And the reason it's effective is because the 100 Years' War is still going on, and Archibald, 4th Earl of Douglas, most powerful lord in Scotland, would normally be able to like push back against these legal claims, but he's in France fighting the 100 Years' War. As a commander, of course, as a commander. A losing commander. He loses the Battle of Verneuil. I don't know how to say it. He was killed there, and his son, Archibald, inherits. So we've got Archibald inheriting from Archibald. But let's not forget, the first Archibald wasn't the son of the second Archibald. So that the Douglas lands shift amongst cousins. And again, this is setting up the pattern that leads to the Black Dinner, where they don't always have to just pass it down. They can kill each other or push each other aside to claim those very powerful lands. Lands that are getting increasingly more powerful. This title is getting more and more valuable with every passing year. In 1427, James I just invites a bunch of lords to parley and just has a bunch of them killed or imprisoned, including that Lord of the Isles. So, like, you can see all this time, Sean, we've been talking about how there's pretty good behavior. You got people get let out of prison and then just going right back. You got nobles not being executed when it would seem to be politically expedient. Yet this guy is kind of taking advantage of that. He's like, well, they're willing to believe that I'm going to give them safe passage. Then he doesn't. So it's like things are backsliding in terms of culture. Arguably it's still pretty bad. They're all fighting over power, which is not the most civilized thing to do. But you can see there was some semblance of honor and agreements and truces, but this seems to be falling apart.
That's one reason to follow rules, to have morality or whatever, is it's about precedent setting. It's like, I don't want someone else to do this to me, so I'm not going to do it to anyone else. Agree, right? You won't kill me, I won't kill you. We're all going to not kill each other. Cool, got it. That's the rule now. But once someone starts breaking a rule and it pays off, well, now other people are motivated to do it. Eventually, it'll come around and no one won't be safe anymore. But it that seems to be, and I can't help but wonder if one reason for this might have been, I'm sure there's a number of reasons, but because of the 100 Years' War, and also the Black Plague was like in the same era. I wonder if life literally just had less value. People were just more accustomed to death, less moved by it. It was more common. It seems so odd to me that all these killings started happening. Just trying to find some way in my mind to understand why it wasn't happening before and it stopped happening later, but it happened a whole lot in this little era here.
Yeah, meanwhile, like, it has started to fall apart in England too. Like during the Wars of the Roses, like Richard III started to or rumor or things that were pinned on him, depending on your view. The things were happening whether Richard did them or not. People were getting murdered, princes disappearing, usurping, kings dying in prison, all sorts of stuff that hadn't been happening. Like they had gone through a time where that wasn't happening as much.
There seemed to be like, ostensibly they wanted to be following the rules, right? It wasn't as blatant open murder as what started happening in the Scotland.
Absolutely. Conflicts. So there's also some like prophecies around this time. Like 1370 is when prophecy started to be more important in England or in Scotland, and it's like there's an interesting thing I read shared to me by Minotaur that Macbeth is not a Scottish play. It's about Scotland. It's about Scottish characters, but it was written by the English. It's Shakespeare wrote that. He was an Englishman, not a Scotsman, right? And this is part of, so in the same way that Macbeth was popularized by England, we've got George R. Martin and HBO popularizing the Black Dinner much later, kind of after the fact. And Macbeth is a story about prophecy. Like Macbeth has a prophecy, and it's like there's all this fulfilling and conflict around that prophecy and the deaths and all this other business. There were prophecies around James's death too. So that's kind of neat that, well, James is going to die. Of course he dies, but some of these maybe were post-mortem, some of them, but maybe not. I don't know. Probably they were written after the fact, but they were written as if they didn't. That's usually how it happens. But anyway, it's neat to see that was part of the story.
By the way, they're so setting themselves up for failure, because if there's some prophecy about James dying, it's like 40 different people like, oh no!
Yep, that's right. So I see this like going real briefly back to this conquest of the Isles. It's sort of like James trying to conquer the free folk. It's like, you can't do that. They can't be, they won't kneel. I mean, that's just not going to happen. So yeah, it didn't work so well. Anyway, here we have the next section, the changing of the James. Or the James of Thrones, maybe should have been what I called it. Anyway, his political problems, they might have said the reason James was such a jerk and the way he was breaking these codes was because he was raised by the English. It's not, if he is a proper Scotsman, he wouldn't have done all this. Anyway, an assassination plot was launched against him because of his policies and other stuff. His own Chamberlain, a different Robert Stuart, assisted 30 men in getting inside the castle. James found out while it was happening and tries to flee through a secret tunnel. Catherine Douglas, lady-in-waiting to the Queen. We've got a Douglas and a Stuart just on the inside here. One's a heel, one's a hero, and Catherine's the hero. She earned the nickname Bar Lass, not because she served drinks at a bar, because she behaved like a bar. And again, not like a bar that serves drinks, but like an actual wooden bar. You know, we've all seen medieval shows and movies where you bar the door. Well, she didn't have a bar, so she used her arm. She put her arm in the bar. They did eventually break her arm. She survived, but she's heroic for that action. It didn't work.
This whole anecdote here is so crazy to me. It's totally the makings of a,
right?
I don't know, an episode of Game of Thrones or something.
It reminds me of Queen Alysanne was set upon by some assassins at Maidenpool, and one of her ladies in waiting died defending her. Another one was wounded and survived. So it's a little similar to that. Unfortunately, Alysanne survived. Well, that's not unfortunate. Alysanne survived, fortunately. Unfortunately, Catherine Barlass's maneuver didn't work for the silliest reason. James was going to flee through the secret tunnel, but it had been closed off. Because of tennis. The tennis balls kept going into the tunnel and they were difficult to get. So
But this tunnel, it's a sewer. It's like a underground waterway. And the king went down in there to escape these assailants. And he hit a dead end. And they just killed him. Just killed the king in a tunnel. Man,
a sewer,
yeah.
A tennis ball sewer. Yep, that's very Scottish because wasn't tennis invented in Scotland? So I think it was, or golf was. I think maybe it was England, but anyway, it's a very Scottish game. Anyway, his heart was also carried to the Holy Land, but it wasn't Braveheart, and it was apparently only for a visit. There was no crusade. It was just bring your heart to the Holy Land, say you went there, and then bring it back and bury it in
the Royal Abbey. Heart.
Yeah, just super heart, not brave heart.
Tennis heart.
Visit heart, the wandering heart. Lots of hearts wander, So 6-year-old James II ascends to the throne with the Red Douglas sort of taking charge and his mother taking charge, or trying to. His mother tried to become regent. Now, she had remarried to the Black Knight of Lorne. What's that? Yeah, go ahead.
She was also in that keep.
Yeah, she was wounded during the
and she escaped, but not without injury. But yeah, just adding to the excitement around. I often you think of kings and nobles, all these courtly people. They're just in some palace in some throne room with tapestries and wine and grapes. But I just trying to imagine them jumping out the window or running into the sewer is such a out of sorts moment.
I know, it's wild. The stories are amazing. So she tries to become regent. She tries to use this as an opportunity to become powerful. And again, like I said, she remarried to a guy named the Black Knight of Lorne, who was a descendant of Alexander Stuart, the fourth High Steward, who all the way back when they defeated the Norse, he's a direct line descendant from that guy. So more Stuarts getting involved here. So this was actually incestuous. But hey, it's okay. They got a papal dispensation because everybody knows with the wave of his hand, the Pope can just remove any possible chance of incest damage, right? There's no genetic liability here. The Pope said so. There was also a certain William Crichton. I don't know if he's related to Michael Crichton, the author. We're a few hundred years ahead of that. This guy's also trying to win power throughout this new regime of James II here. But Robert Stuart confessed to his part in the assassination, and the truth coming out changed a lot of things. It had a domino effect. Queen Joan is kind of pushed aside. She's not able to do anything anymore. The Black Knight of Lorne they're pushed aside. And who becomes protector of the realm? And Lieutenant General Archibald Douglas, 5th Earl of Douglas. Archibald back in the game. Now, Archibald had 3 children. William, then Margaret, called the Fair Lady of Galloway, and another David. Now, Archibald was only lieutenant general for 2 years. He had been the earl for a while, but he died of a fever only 2 years into his protectorship of the realm. His son William becomes 6th earl, and right after he becomes 6th earl, he's invited to a meal. A meal, the one that you eat later in the day, not breakfast, not lunch, not brunch. What's that final meal called?
Second lunch?
No, not that one.
Pre-dinner?
No, a little farther.
Linner?
Not Linner. We're getting there. Yeah, so dinner.
Supper.
Supper. He was invited to supper, that's right, at Edinburgh Castle. William, 6th Earl, pretty happy with his new position. He's only 16 years old. He and his brother were invited. His brother, the David that we just mentioned. So William and David bring their dudes. They go to the Black Dinner, the event that brought us here in the first place. With Archibald V's death, an opportunity came for James Douglas to usurp the power that had belonged to his father, Archibald. Now, this James was the son of Archibald the Grim, who was the 3rd Earl and the 1st Archibald of this group. This is the 3rd Archibald, who is Archibald V. So he wants the lands that just passed to William to come back to his corner of the family. Those are his nephews, his great nephews, the William and David, who were invited to the Black Dinner. So it's a family struggle. It's a family it's infighting for power. That same William Crichton guy that I just mentioned, who may or may not be related to Michael Crichton, had become the royal chancellor. And he was the primary architect along with this guy, the justiciar, Sir Alexander Livingston. So he's kind of like the new regent, like the hand of the king, this William Crichton guy. By the way, the date of this event, this dinner, was November 24th, 1440. Some of you astute listeners may realize that the original date we planned for this episode was November 24th, 2024.
But I was too scared.
Shay was too scared of the omens.
Yeah.
Also, we were going to Spain, and that kind of threw things off. But really, we were having our own Thanksgiving, which we did not want to associate with the Black dinner. You can't have the Black Friendsgiving. You can't have that. No, we did not have that. We avoided all such curses. So what happens? You got William, 6th Earl of Douglas, with his brother David. They show up. Again, he's only 16 years old. Maybe, he inherits a whole lot of power. Maybe he's a little naive because he's only 16. Maybe he doesn't know what's coming. Maybe. Regardless, like Sean said at the beginning, we don't know a lot of the details that happen. Legend says, while they're eating, a black bull's head is placed in front of them. This is the Rains of Castamere starting to play during the Red Wedding. It's the same thing. Of course, George, because it's a story in his version, added a heck of a lot more literary foreshadowing. Well, before that, there was also the drums, the rain, the breaking of the hurting Walder Frey's pride, all sorts of things that were there. Some of these things were probably present too. We're just not as aware of them because history doesn't record them. But there probably were some other clues to this.
By the way, I've a couple things to add here, which might come into play as we get a little deeper. But
fire away.
The kid, he was only, quote unquote, only 16. But remember, some other kid that was only 17 was king. Lots of 16-year-olds ride off into battle and have
Robb
power
Stark was 16.
And ambition. And so, not a lot is known about him. But, again, digging into this just to try to figure out, what was going on here. There is this possibility that he was ambitious. He had an entourage of dozens of armed soldiers that he rode around with all the time. And that might have come off as a threat, at least to some people. Whether he meant it to be or not, whether he had some intention of recruiting more or attacking towns, but you could see how some people might feel threatened, especially when this Douglas family is so powerful already. Also, he was invited to the Scottish Parliament and didn't go. Now, maybe he didn't go because there was a storm, or he's a kid, or maybe because it was like a stance, like he was not acknowledging the authority of the Parliament. And even if that wasn't the case, some people in Parliament might have perceived it that way, or might be convinced that that was it, however they did perceive it. So before the actual dinner, he actually spent a few days at the estate there and got to know the young king, the 10-year-old King James. They were like him and the David brother. They were all like friends and playing games and getting to know each other. And when it was time for the actual dinner, he left his entourage behind at the estate to go to the actual dining hall and was warned not to. There was this one other guy with him that's like, it might not be safe. Don't take a chance. Just bring a few guards with you. Nah, the king's my friend. I don't need to. And just went on his own with his little brother and his one other guardian. So I think
that other guardian was killed also. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a great point, Sean, because yes, the King James II was there, but he was only 10 years old. So yeah, they're friends, but he doesn't actually have authority. It's this Crichton guy and the Red Douglas, some of these other, and James Douglas, who was conniving at all this. Those are the guys that were behind the scenes here. So the charge is treason. They bring out the Black Bull's head. Maybe that didn't happen. I did some research. I cannot find anything about the Black Bull's head. I don't have any other examples of it happening. I couldn't find anything. Maybe it's so obscure that it's not on the internet, but I couldn't find anything.
In some tellings, it's a black boar's head.
Oh.
And in either case, it's supposed to be a symbol of death. And
yeah.
That was like, when it came out, it was like, whoa.
That's why it's the Rains of Castamere. Perfect parallel there. Yeah. So the charge was treason. They were given a mock trial and their heads were cut off, both William and David. So James Douglas, son of Archibald the Grim, becomes Earl Douglas, and he becomes the most powerful lord in Scotland. So he's killed his own grandnephews. He becomes nicknamed James the Gross, so there's that. because, he's was kind of a gross thing to do. He would pass the earldom to, he would eventually pass the earldom to William, 8th Earl of Douglas, only 3 years later, because he didn't live very long. And it becomes a case of what goes around comes around. Like we started to show these types of violence was escalating. And here at the Black Dinner, 1440, it's almost immediately after, or very soon after, there's similar atrocities or violations of guest right, or whatever you want to call it, and more examples of kinslaying. So it's almost straightforward. Like, there's not a lot of reasons. I complained at the beginning of this episode that there's not great analysis on this that's out there. Unlike the Wars of the Rose, there's lots of great analysis out there. It's just like, people are like, I don't know why he did this. It's easy to see why he did this. These are just heirs of the original Black Douglas fighting over the insanely powerful Douglas titles. It's just that simple. There's really no, it's like, oh, it was an ideal. No, they killed this guy for power, or this kid for power. It's very straightforward, I think.
And, it's interesting,
yeah,
as you say, but there's not a ton of talk about it. Dornish Dame in the chat said, shockingly, given how interesting all of this is, Scottish history is not taught in any detail in Scottish school.
There you go.
They're talking about other eras and more European history in general, so even in their schools.
It's a bit of a shame. They should teach, maybe not this to young people. This is a little R-rated for the kids, but still, and the teenagers could learn this, maybe the college students.
I think some of the mystery is why this Crichton guy did it, because he didn't stand to directly gain anything.
Exactly.
And it doesn't seem like James the Gross, who stood to gain the most, was actively involved in it.
Yeah.
But maybe they expected to get favor from him, and you can imagine all the kind of
pressure from him. Yeah, maybe he promised them rewards that history isn't privy to. But yeah, you're right, because it's a little odd, because Crichton got away with it.
Yeah.
The only thing that happens in the rest of his life of note that we could find, like Wikipedia or elsewhere, was just he eventually loaned James II a bunch of money. Maybe this is money that the Douglases paid him as part of this. But regardless, that's it. That's like the only, he just kind of got away with it and retired and died normally. Now, when James reached adulthood in 1449... he had Douglas assistance in getting rid of this Livingston guy that was another conniver, another conspirator. So it appears two of the conspirators turned on each other. Shocking, right? That never happens. People who are willing to do murders and theft and all this sort of thing, they would never do that to each other.
That's another sort of speculation, by the way, the fact that these two guys did, at least for years and years and years, seemingly got away with this. It makes people wonder who else might have been involved or gained from it or condoned it or whatever.
Yeah.
The fact that they weren't immediately punished makes it seem like there were probably more people in on the conspiracy,
Yeah. So now we have the next event, the Blackfyre dinner. Again, just think of these Douglases. They're very Tyrellish, Freyish, or Lannister. You kill a few of them, but there's just always someone else to replace them. There's always more Douglases to come out of the woodwork. Douglas, is that the plural of Douglases? No, Doug. Anyway, the Black Dinner didn't really break the power of Clan Douglas at all. I've seen that floated as a reason, but that's just kind of silly. Of course it wasn't going to do that. It just moved the power to a different Douglas, an older, more dangerous Douglas. And just
James the Gross that got most of those titles. Some of them got divvied around, but I think he just died like a year later.
3 years later, yeah, very quickly after, yeah.
But still, that wasn't the end either. It just went to some other Douglas, right?
Yeah.
Or some Doug Lad.
Some Doug Lass, yes.
Doug Lass and Doug Lads.
Oh, yeah.
So James II, when he comes of age, go ahead.
Before you continue, even though I know this next part is so interesting, I just have to go. I love this episode and this topic, but I have something I have to do now.
We're running a bit long. We're going to finish. It'll only take us about 15 minutes to finish, so folks, stick with us. But we'll say goodbye to Sean for now. Thank you for your great input, your great takes, and we'll see you next time.
All right.
The rest of you, let's do the Blackfyre dinner. That's just my own name for it. We got the Black Dinner followed up by the Blackfyre dinner, and it's because it's a Blackfyre parallel. That's why. Now, James II, when he came of age, he leveraged that same Douglas power that had been shifted around so much times to help himself get established. So he invites that 8th Earl of Douglas, the son of James the Gross, who only ruled for 3 years, and promises him safe conduct. Now, he promises him safe conduct because, well, you can see why. In this era, there's a lot of murders going on. People couldn't trust each other that much. Black Dinner was only 12 years old. But he did not give him safe conduct. So we got a real Aenys, Blackfyre, Bloodraven situation here. He accused William of Southron ambitions, basically, saying, hey, you're allying with all these people. You need to not do that. And he's like, I'm going to do that. And so, despite the promise of safe conduct, he stabbed him 26 times. That is, the king himself, James II, stabbed William, the 8th Earl of Douglas, 26 times, then threw his body out the window, just for good measure. And then more people just started hacking away at him. One dude, like, slammed an axe into his face. Like, that was kind of unnecessary, but, you know, they did it. All right, you got me. That wasn't a dinner, but it was Blackfyre-ish because of Aenys and Bloodraven. Now, to complete the parallel, the new Earl of Douglas, the 9th Earl of Douglas, who is the last Earl of Douglas, the last Black Douglas Earl, he now takes the earldom, and he should be described. Because he's part of the picture here. He's got the look. And by the look, I mean he had a red birthmark on his cheek like Bloodraven did. His nickname was Fiery Face. Because he had a temper and because of that birthmark on his face, which was red, like Bloodraven's also red birthmark. James responded to his father's stabbing Yes, I was right the first time. We got James versus James. James responded to his stabbing of his father by attaching the false letter of safe conduct to a horse and having that horse ride through town to sort of show everybody what King James had done, to show how he had, violated this order of safe conduct. Despite this James Douglas being kind of in the right here, he didn't end up doing so well. So now we have our last section, the Black Douglas death. James kept on warring against the Earl of Douglas. He kept fighting against this same James. It was James versus James, game of James. And for about 3 years, James Douglas was winning. He kept winning in these battles, but there was a marriage to Margaret Douglas, the fair maid of Galloway. And she had inherited Galloway after the Black Dinner. She actually inherited land because her brother had both those titles, and one passed to her. Real Marjorie Tyrell vibes with the fair maid of Galloway. So she had been married to the 8th Earl. The 8th Earl was killed, and she married the 9th Earl. And then, when the 9th Earl was eventually lost his lands and later died, she married John Stuart. So they just go Douglas, Stuart. Yeah. It actually looked, this war was going so well in James Douglas's favor that it might look like James II would lose the throne. But he was finally able to win enough support from the other nobles to put down James Douglas, 9th Earl. James escaped, but his 3 brothers, who were all lords, were killed or executed in this final battle of Arkenholm, not to be confused with the Arkenstone of Lord of the Rings fame, or Ianholm of Lord of the Rings fame, Arkenholm. The commander in the final battle against this Black Douglases, George Douglas, 4th Earl of the Red Douglas line. So this final battle had Red Douglas versus Black Douglas. And then James II had done so well, his defeat of the Black Douglases was powerful enough and secure enough that he was actually able to have Parliament forfeit all Black Douglas lands. The Black Douglases were completely purged as nobles. Their lands were seized and redistributed. Now, James II died only about 5 years later in 1460, trying to retake that same Roxburgh Castle that the English still held from the Wars of Independence. Even though they won those wars, the English still had Roxburgh Castle. But I'm sad Sean missed this little anecdote because we talked about this before as a thing that could happen. How did he die? He stood too close to one of his own cannons and it backfired and it killed him. Just like that. Simple as that. Just the most ignominious death. Who finished the siege of Roxburgh Castle in his place, though? The Red Douglas. He did the job. So who ascends after James II? James III. His mother handled Scotland for a little while because James III was young. The Wars of the Roses were getting started. And James III later in his life was opposed by a guy named Archibald Bell the Cat, with hyphens, Bell-the-cat, who was a Red Douglas. Now, the Ninth Earl, even though he lost, he still survived until 1484, where he and Alexander Stuart of the disenfranchised Albany Stuarts teamed up. This is also the second son of King James II. So you got an Alexander Stuart who's son of the king. This is James III's brother. So the king's brother teams up with the last Earl of the Black Douglases to fight one last try. But their ally backed out at the last minute. And who was their ally? Everything comes together here at the end. It was Richard III, our main subject of the Wars of the Roses episode. Instead of supporting them, he just gave them permission, like they needed it. But so their invasion backfired really badly. This is why the final battle, I said it already happened, because there was no battle here, really, not much of one. They invaded. They were hoping for local support. Instead, the locals turned on them. The locals attacked them. Rather than waiting for an army, they just attacked them. So Douglas was captured, never a factor again. Prince Alexander escaped to France, where he was killed the following year in a duel. He challenged the Duke of Orleans. The Duke of Orleans killed him because of a splinter from his lance got him. It was maybe like Gregor fighting Hugh of the Vale, except that the Duke of Orleans probably wasn't nearly as large as Gregor Clegane, but same result. The Duke of Orleans eventually became King of France, so this was not just some random duke. Not that any duke is really that random. So, with the end of both the Albany Stuarts and the Black Douglases, royal power in Scotland entered an entirely new phase. The Red Douglases stuck around, but they had learned their lesson. In this new era, they maintained their power without getting too close to the top. They never got burned. They stuck around. There were some disputes, of course, back and forth. But as I said at the beginning, the Red Douglases are still around today. There's the Lord Douglas Hamilton that still exists. There's the Douglases of Scotland. Scotland, I said that. The Douglases of Sweden. There's a Swedish branch of the Red Douglases that still exists to this day as well. So ultimately, the family was very successful despite the fall of the Black Douglases. As I also said at the beginning, there's no real end here, nor is there really a beginning here. There's just our version, the History of Westeros version of the Wars of Scottish Independence, the war against the Norse, the tales of Robert the Bruce, and all the Stuarts and Douglases. Our interpretation, our version, we got to stop somewhere. Rebels with James the Son's third, who was James, tried to pull a Rhaegar and Aenys, right? They tried to put James down, but not kill him, just sort of force him to abdicate. But King James just died instead during this. So it kind of worked, just he died instead of them putting him in prison. James IV ascended, who was followed by James V, who was followed by Mary, Queen of Scots. And after that, the crown of Scotland was united with the crown of England and Ireland, and Great Britain became a thing. So, as you can see, we covered a lot, but there's endless stories. There's so many we didn't tell. There's so many more tales of Douglas, Stuart, and other families that weren't named. Hopefully, I've inspired you to check some more of this out, or at least inspire you to vote for episodes like this in Topics Moot, or to just, tweet at us or blue sky at us or send us messages to say, hey, I liked episodes like this. Make more of them. Final footnote, the Stone of Destiny. Sean alluded to some of this, but yes, the British monarchs kept using it. Some kids stole it in 1950. They stashed it in a church where it was later found. Like Sean said, it was really heavy, so it's kind of amazing they pulled this off. There were 4 kids that stole it. If you go to the Wikipedia article on the Stone of Destiny, you can see there's links to 3 of these kids you can read about these 3 kids that stole. One of them doesn't have a link. Alan Stewart. Maybe the Stewart family doesn't want this kid associated with all that, but it's hilarious to me that a Stewart was involved in stealing back the Stone of Destiny many years later in 1950. I don't know, how many years later was that? Still somehow like 640 some years later. So yeah, in 1996, it was returned for real, and it's now on display in Scotland. You can go see it if you want. Next week, The Shadow by a Shy. It's sort of a long post-sequel to our Ashai by the Shadow episode made many, many years ago. I want to shout out as well our long ago episode, The Witch Queen of Harrenhal. It talks about Alice Rivers, but it also has the guest Shakes of Thrones and Joe Magician. But in that episode, Shakes of Thrones talked about witches and prophecy, a lot of which comes from Macbeth and Shakespeare. So it's very related to some of that little bit of prophecy we talked about. And I also want to bring to you our cat Xerxes, the blue-eyed Persian boy. Can you hear him? Is he purring into the microphone? Maybe not. He's not really happy about being picked up like this. But we didn't have Sean's cat today, or one of Sean's cats, so we grabbed one of our own. We make do. Thank you, everybody. An extra long episode today, but as you can see, we had a lot to cover. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks to Nina. Congrats again on her nuptials to James. Again, the only living James we discussed today. Thanks as well to Joey and Jesse and Bran, those kind folks who made our music and adapted our music and made videos for our show to introduce it. That also goes for Michael Klarfeld, who made our original video intro. You can check Michael out at claradox.de, K-L-A-R-A-D-O-X.de. You can buy copies of his maps, just the files if you want. Go get them printed yourself. Nice and cheap that way.
Can I say, Xerxes is a Persian name, but is a Siamese cat. I just needed to say that.
Yes.
For his sake.
That is a very good point. Yes. Persian cats are entirely different. That's the big fluffy one. So, yeah.
Yeah, if anyone was confused, that's why Aziz said Persian cat.
Yeah, because he has a Persian name.
Yeah, it wasn't a weird...
He's not actually a Persian cat. Yeah. He is clearly a Siamese. A very beautiful Siamese boy with blue eyes. And we will be back next time for more. And you know what to do. Valar, reread us.